Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This story takes me back to a cool October night just a few years ago. I was home from college, and a group of my closest friends decided to reconnect after years apart. We had grown up together in a small, sleepy town bordered by dense woods and an old bridge steeped in local legend. They called it Raven's Crossing, a narrow, rusty span that stretched over a deep, rocky gorge. I remember the crisp autumn air as we sat around a bonfire in Jake's backyard, the scent of burning wood mingling with the sweetness of marshmallows we toasted unevenly over the flames. Jake, the unofficial leader of our group, was always the one with the big ideas, and that night was no different. "Guys," he said, grinning in that way that let you know trouble was coming. "We've never done it. Never had the guts. Let's cross the bridge tonight." Jake was the fearless one, the one who'd always climbed the tallest trees and swam the deepest parts of the lake. Next to him was Mark, his polar opposite, cautious and practical, with an almost encyclopedic knowledge of urban legends. Then there was Alex, who lived for a thrill, but always ended up being the first to admit when he was scared. And finally, there was me somewhere in between, always up for an adventure, but never entirely convinced we wouldn't regret it later. Raven's Crossing had been the subjects of countless ghost stories over the years. Locals whispered about strange lights, phantom footsteps, and the feeling of being watched as you crossed its creaking planks. Older kids dared each other to go out there in the dead of night, but most chickened out long before setting foot on the bridge. That night, sitting under the stars, Jake's challenge hung in the air. "Let's settle it once and for all," he said, leaning forward, his face half lit by the flickering firelight. Mark rolled his eyes. "You know people say it's cursed for a reason, right? They say a woman fell from it decades ago. Her screams echo through the gorge when the wind blows just right." Yeah, Jake replied, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "It's just a bridge. It's not like we believe that crap, right?" Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Do we really have to do this? I mean, what if it's not safe?" Jake laughed, tossing a stick into the fire. "Come on, man. It's fine. You'll see. Just think of the bragging rights." I remember the way the flames danced in his eyes as he said it, how the night seemed a little darker beyond the circle of our firelight. The woods around us felt alive with the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. We argued back and forth for a while, but in the end, Jake's confidence won us over. We piled into his old Jeep, packed flashlights and a thermos of coffee, and headed toward the bridge. The drive was quiet, the road winding through the woods like a shadowy tunnel. The only light came from our headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees grew thicker as we approached Raven's Crossing, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to warn us away. By the time we reached the bridge, the sense of adventure had been replaced by an uneasy silence. We parked a few yards away and stepped out into the cool night air. The sound of the rushing river below was louder than I had anticipated, a steady roar that seemed to fill the entire gorge. The bridge itself was as eerie as the stories had described. The wooden planks looked weathered and uneven, some warped from years of exposure to the elements. The metal railings were streaked with rust, and a faint mist hovered just above the surface of the water far below. Jake grabbed his flashlight and took the first step onto the bridge. "See?" he called back, his voice echoing. "It's just wood and metal. Nothing to be afraid of." Mark followed reluctantly, muttering something about how stupid this was, while Alex and I hesitated at the edge. There was something about the bridge, about the way it loomed in the moonlight that made my stomach tighten. "Come on," Jake called, his voice carrying back to us. "Are you scared?" I swallowed my unease and stepped onto the first plank. It creaked under my weight, sending a shiver up my spine. Alex followed close behind, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. As we made our way toward the middle of the bridge, the air seemed to change. It felt colder somehow, heavier, like the weight of the night was pressing down on us. The river below roared louder, and the wind picked up, whistling through the railings with an almost human wail. "See? Nothing to it," Jake said, his voice breaking the spell for a moment. But even as he spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something about the silence beyond his words felt charged, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And that's when it happened, the first sign that this night would be unlike any other. As we reached the midpoint of Raven's Crossing, the night seemed to close in around us. The only sounds were the steady rushing of the river below and the occasional creak of the planks beneath our feet. Jake was in the lead, his flashlight sweeping across the narrow bridge, while Mark followed a few steps behind, muttering under his breath about how ridiculous this whole thing was. Alex and I brought up the rear, moving slower, our footsteps hesitant. It was just as we started to feel somewhat at ease after all. Nothing overtly frightening had happened that the first strange event occurred. At first, it was subtle, something easy to dismiss. "Hey," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the river. "Do you hear that?" I paused, tilting my head to listen. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the wind and the water below. But then I caught it, a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead of us. Jake turned back, his flashlight beam catching my face. "What's up? Do you hear that?" Alex asked again, louder this time. Jake and Mark both stopped, the four of us standing still in the middle of the bridge. For a moment, there was only silence, but then the tapping resumed, faint but distinct. It sounded like something or someone was knocking on the metal railing further down the bridge. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, his voice steady. "Metal expands, contracts, you know how it goes." Mark didn't look convinced. "Metal doesn't knock like that," he muttered, gripping his flashlight a little tighter. "Relax," Jake said, rolling his eyes. "You guys are acting like we're in some horror movie." Despite his bravado, even Jake seemed a little more cautious as he took a step forward. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. We exchanged uneasy glances but kept walking, Jake leading the way. A few steps later, we noticed something else, shadows moving along the bridge. At first, I thought it was just our flashlights catching the railings at odd angles, but then I realized the shadows didn't correspond to our movements. They flickered and shifted as if something was darting just outside the beams of light. "What the hell?" Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake stopped again, sweeping his flashlight in a wide arc. "It's nothing. Probably just the trees casting weird shadows." Alex grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Does that look like trees to you?" he asked, nodding toward a dark, formless shape that seemed to move across the planks ahead of us. "Okay, that's a little creepy," Jake admitted, though he tried to keep his tone light. The shape vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us staring at an empty stretch of bridge. My heart was pounding now, the weight of the night pressing heavier with each passing moment. As we stood there, unsure whether to keep going or turn back, the air around us grew colder. It wasn't just the typical chill of an autumn night. This was something different. It felt unnatural, biting, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. "Are you guys feeling this?" Mark asked, wrapping his arms around himself. Jake nodded, his confidence faltering for the first time. "Yeah, weird." Then came the voice. It was faint at first, carried on the winds like a whisper, but as we strained to hear, it grew louder. It wasn't any of us speaking. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and melodic, calling out from somewhere in the darkness. "Do you hear that?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. We all nodded silently, our eyes darting around as we tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was coming from ahead of us, near the far end of the bridge, where the shadows seemed to gather like a living thing. Jake took a deep breath, forcing a grin. "It's probably just someone messing with us. Kids, maybe. Trying to scare us." "Kids?" Mark shot back, his voice rising. "It's almost midnight. What kids would be out here?" Jake didn't have an answer, but he wasn't ready to admit he was spooked. "Let's just keep going. We're halfway across." Turning back now would be lame. Reluctantly, we started moving again, each step heavier than the last. The woman's voice faded in and out, sometimes clear enough to make out what sounded like words, other times a distant hum. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt it. The voice wasn't coming from a person. It was something else. The tapping returned, louder this time, echoing from multiple spots on the bridge. It wasn't just one knock anymore, it was a series, like someone or something was following us. "Okay, this is not funny anymore," Alex said, his voice cracking. "It's just the winds," Jake said, though he didn't sound as sure as he had before. But I knew it wasn't the wind. None of us said it, but we all felt the same thing, that we were being watched. As we neared the far end of the bridge, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Every step felt like a gamble, every sound magnified in the stillness. Then, just as we thought we might make it across without further incident, the lights of our flashlights flickered and died simultaneously, plunging us into darkness. A chorus of panicked voices erupted as we scrambled to turn them back on. "What the hell just happened?" Mark shouted, his voice echoing into the void. "I don't know," Jake snapped, smacking his flashlight against his palm. When the lights finally came back on, we were greeted by an eerie sight. Scattered across the planks in front of us were small, childlike handprints, glistening faintly as though they had just been made. They stretched in both directions, as if whoever or whatever had made them was circling us. No one spoke for a long moment, the reality of the situation sinking in. Finally, Alex broke the silence. "We need to leave. Now." For the first time that night, Jake didn't argue. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Let's get out of here." We turned and started back the way we had come, moving faster than before. The handprints seemed to follow us, appearing on the planks just behind our feet. And then we heard it again, the woman's voice, louder this time, filled with a mournful, almost pleading tone. It sent a chill down my spine, the kind of fear that grips you deep in your chest and doesn't let go. None of us looked back. We didn't need to. Whatever was on that bridge with us didn't want us there, and we weren't about to find out why. The hurried retreat across Raven's Crossing should have brought relief, but instead, it only deepened the dread hanging over us. The faint chill from before had grown into an icy grip that clung to the air around us. The rhythmic tapping, now louder and more erratic, seemed to echo our racing heartbeats. We didn't stop, didn't speak, just moved as quickly as we dared on the creaking wooden planks. As we neared the starting point of the bridge, Alex stumbled, his flashlight clattering to the ground. The beam spun wildly, casting disorienting shadows along the rails. "Leave it," Jake barked, but Alex wouldn't. He dropped to his knees, fumbling in the dark to retrieve it. That's when it happened. The voice returned, clearer and closer than ever, a soft, mournful cry that sent shivers through the marrow of our bones. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, filling the air, pressing down on us like a weight we couldn't escape. "It's saying something," Alex whispered, frozen in place. His flashlight lay forgotten at his side. "What?" Mark hissed, his voice barely audible. Alex shook his head, his eyes wide. I can't understand it, but it's right here." We didn't dare linger. Grabbing Alex by the arm, Jake hauled him to his feet, and we all bolted the rest of the way off the bridge, not stopping until we were a safe distance away, the bridge a dark silhouette behind us. The safety of solid ground did little to calm us. The voice still seemed to echo in my ears, and the handprints, glistening like fresh dew, were burned into my memory. Jake tried to act like nothing was wrong, but his bravado had cracks in it now, visible in the tight line of his jaw and the way he avoided meeting anyone's eyes. "All right," he said, his voice forced and too loud. "We made it. Let's call it a night." Mark was having none of it. "What the hell was that, Jake? You can't tell me that was the wind or some kids. That was something else." "It doesn't matter what it was," Jake snapped. "We're done. It's over." But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Later that night, none of us could sleep. We'd gone back to Jake's place, where the living room lights stayed stubbornly on, and the TV played mindless reruns to fill the oppressive silence. Jake paced restlessly, Mark stared blankly at his phone, and Alex and I sat on the couch, lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Alex broke the silence. "We need to know what's going on," he said, his voice steady but quiet. Jake stopped pacing. "What's going on is that we went somewhere we shouldn't have. That's it." "No," Alex insisted. "That's not it. That voice, those handprints, there's something on that bridge, something we disturbed, and I need to know what it is." It was Mark who found the first clue. After a fruitless hour of scrolling through local history websites, he stumbled upon a post buried deep in an old online forum. It was a thread about Raven's Crossing, titled "The Ghost of the Bridge." The story was vague and fragmented, pieced together from old rumors and whispered tales. A woman, the post claimed, had died on the bridge decades ago, whether by accident, suicide, or something more sinister wasn't clear. But her spirit, they said, lingered there, searching for something she'd lost. The handprints, the tapping, the voice, it all matched. "Okay," Jake said when Mark read the post aloud. "So it's a ghost story. Every old bridge has one. This isn't just a story, Jake," Alex said. "We saw it. We heard it." Jake didn't respond, but the set of his shoulders told me he wasn't as skeptical as he wanted to seem. It was Alex's idea to go back. "We have to," he said, his eyes glinting with a mix of determination and fear. "We can't just leave it like this." Jake protested. Mark wavered, but in the end, we all found ourselves standing at the edge of Raven's Crossing once more, flashlights in hand, the night even darker and colder than before. The first few steps were uneventful, though the weight of the air felt heavier, pressing down on us like a warning. The river below was louder, its rush like the murmur of distant voices. Halfway across, the tapping started again, faster this time, echoing all around us. Jake cursed under his breath, sweeping his flashlight wildly. "Where is it coming from?" Before anyone could answer, Alex pointed to the ground. The handprints. They were back, fresher and more defined, scattered across the planks in no discernible pattern. As we stared, they seemed to multiply, spreading like ink stains on a page. Then the voice returned, louder than ever. This time, we could make out words, though they were distorted, stretched, and warped by the wind. "Help me," it said, over and over, a desperate plea that sent chills racing down my spine. "Who are you?" Alex called out, his voice trembling. The voice didn't answer, but the air around us seemed to shift, growing colder and heavier. The shadows thickened, moving with a purpose that couldn't be explained away as tricks of light. And then, for the first time, we saw her. She appeared at the far end of the bridge, barely more than a silhouette at first. Her figure was shrouded in darkness, but her face was pale, almost luminous, her eyes empty and hollow. She stood motionless, watching us, her presence both sorrowful and menacing. Alex took a step forward, but Mark grabbed his arm. "Don't," he hissed. The woman didn't move, didn't speak, but her gaze seemed to pierce through us, a silent demand that we couldn't ignore. "What does she want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No one answered. We were frozen, caught between the urge to flee and the inexplicable pull of her presence. The tapping grew louder, almost deafening, and the bridge began to shake beneath our feet. The air crackled with an energy that felt alive, charged with something beyond our understanding. "Let's go," Jake said finally, his voice barely steady. "Now." But as we turned to leave, the woman moved. It was subtle at first, a small shift forward, but it was enough to send us into a full-blown panic. We ran, the planks creaking and groaning beneath our feet, the voice following us, growing louder and more insistent with each step. "Help me," it cried, the words ringing in my ears long after we'd reached solid ground. When we finally stopped, breathless and trembling, we turned back to look at the bridge. It was empty. No handprints, no shadows, no woman. Just the dark, silent structure stretching across the river, as if nothing had ever happened. But we knew better. Something had happened, and whatever it wasn't over. The silence after our escape was oppressive, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. Back at Jake's house, we sat in a semicircle, our faces lit by the dim glow of a single lamp. No one spoke at first. The weight of what we'd seen and heard clung to us. It was Alex who finally broke the silence. "We have to go back," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "No way," Jake shot back immediately. "We're done with that bridge. It's not safe. Hell, it's not normal." Alex shook his head. "You heard her. She's asking for help. We can't just leave it like that." "She?" Mark's voice was sharp, his eyes narrowing. "That wasn't a person, Alex. That was. I don't know what, but it wasn't someone you can just help." "We don't know that," Alex snapped, rising to his feet. "What if she's trapped there? What if there's something we can do to end it? Are we just going to ignore it and hope it goes away?" Jake scoffed, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Mark looked down, avoiding everyone's gaze. I wanted to side with Alex, I did, but the thought of stepping onto that bridge again made my stomach churn. "We go back," Alex said firmly. "If you guys won't come with me, I'll go alone." "You're insane," Jake muttered, but no one stopped Alex as he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. By the time we reached the bridge, the moon was high, casting an eerie silver light over the scene. The river glistened below, its roar quieter now, almost subdued, as if it too was waiting. This time, we came prepared, or as prepared as we could be. Alex carried a bundle of candles and matches. Jake had a crowbar, and Mark held a heavy-duty flashlight. I brought a notebook and pen, though I wasn't sure why. The bridge looked different in the moonlight. The weathered woods seemed darker, the shadows deeper. As we stepped onto the planks, the air grew heavy again, pressing down on us like an unseen hand. We reached the middle of the bridge without incident, though every creak and groan of the wood beneath our feet set my nerves on edge. Alex knelt and began lighting the candles, placing them in a circle around us. "What's this supposed to do?" Jake asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Alex didn't look up. "It's a way to focus energy, create a safe space. Jake rolled his eyes but didn't argue. The moment the last candle was lit, the air changed. It wasn't a gradual shift this time, it was immediate and absolute. The temperature plummeted, and the wind, which had been a gentle whisper, became a howl that seemed to carry voices within it. Then she appeared. This time, there was no mistaking her. She stood just beyond the circle of candles, her pale face illuminated by their flickering light. Her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto Alex as if she recognized him. "Help me," she said, her voice no longer distorted. It was clear now, hauntingly human and filled with despair. Alex stepped forward, but the moment his foot crossed the boundary of the candlelight, the wind surged, blowing out several flames. The shadows thickened, crawling toward us like living things. "Don't move," I shouted, grabbing Alex's arm. The woman's expression changed. Her sorrow deepened, but there was something else now, anger. The tapping began again, rapid and chaotic, echoing all around us. "What do you want?" Mark yelled, his voice shaking. The woman raised a hand, pointing to the planks beneath our feet. "Find it," she said, her voice a low, guttural whisper. "Find what?" Alex asked desperately. Before she could answer, the bridge began to shake violently. The candles fell, their flames extinguished, and the darkness swallowed us whole. The shaking intensified, and I lost my balance, falling hard onto the wooden planks. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet, just as a deafening crack echoed through the air. "Move!" he shouted, and we scrambled toward the nearest end of the bridge. The planks beneath us splintered and buckled, pieces of wood crashing into the river below. The tapping was deafening now, merging with the sound of the rushing water and the woman's cries. But then Alex stopped. "There!" he shouted, pointing to a small rusted box lodged between two planks. "You're not seriously," Jake began, but Alex was already on his knees, prying the box free. The moment he held it in his hands, everything stopped. The shaking, the tapping, the wind, it all ceased as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence was absolute, oppressive in its finality. We stood frozen, staring at the box. It was small, no larger than a showbox, and covered in rust and grime. Alex held it as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. "What is it?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alex didn't answer. He opened the box slowly, revealing its contents. A stack of old letters, yellowed with age, tied together with a faded red ribbon. The woman's voice returned, softer now, almost tender. "Thank you," she said. We turned to look at her, but she was gone. The bridge, the river, the night itself, it all seemed different, quieter, less oppressive. We didn't say much as we made our way back to Jake's house. Alex clutched the box tightly, his knuckles white. Mark walked in silence, his flashlight swinging loosely at his side. Jake kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting to see her again. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The immediate danger was gone, but the questions remained. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why did she need us to find the letters? Back at the house, we opened the letters one by one, piecing together her story. They were love letters, written by a woman named Eleanor to a man named James. The last letter, dated nearly a century ago, spoke of her despair after his sudden death. "I think she was trying to find peace," Alex said quietly. Jake scoffed, but his usual bravado was gone. "Let's just hope she found it." We didn't talk much after that. There was nothing left to say. The night had taken something from each of us, and we weren't sure we'd ever get it back. The room was silent except for the faint crackling of the fire in Jake's living room. We had decided to stay together for the rest of the night, too shaken to go our separate ways. Alex sat on the couch, the rusted box resting on his lap. He stared at it like it held all the answers, or perhaps none at all. Jake broke the silence first. "So, what do we do now? Do we take it somewhere?" "Take it where?" Mark asked, his voice laced with frustration. "It's a box of letters. Who even knows if they matter anymore?" "They mattered to her," Alex said firmly, not looking up. "And she's gone now. I think she just wanted someone to care." Mark exhaled heavily, slumping in his chair. "So that's it? We did what we were supposed to do?" "Maybe," I said, though I didn't feel sure. She disappeared after Alex found the box. Everything stopped. That's gotta mean something, right? As the hours dragged on, the tension in the room began to ease, but none of us dared to bring up what we'd seen or heard. We didn't talk about the tapping, the shaking bridge, or the woman's hollow, sorrowful eyes. It felt too raw, too fresh. The letters sat on the coffee table, still tied with their faded ribbon. No one touched them again after we read through them earlier. Jake's voice was softer now. "Do you think she'll come back? If we didn't do enough?" Alex shook his head. "I don't think so. She's free now. Or at least as free as she could be after all this time." But even as he spoke, a lingering unease hung in the air. None of us really knew if it was over. The next day, we gathered again. This time, in the clear light of morning, things felt different. Less oppressive, though the weight of the previous night's events still lingered. Alex had made up his mind. "We need to do one more thing," he said. "Alex," Jake began, groaning. "No, hear me out," Alex continued. "These letters, they were important to her. They were her connection to whoever James was. I think we need to take them somewhere meaningful." Mark raised an eyebrow. "And where would that be? The bridge? Some cemetery we don't even know exists?" "I don't think it's the bridge," Alex said, his tone measured. "But there has to be some place that mattered to her. Somewhere she felt at peace with James. We owe her that much." The rest of us exchanged glances. It wasn't a perfect plan, but none of us could deny Alex's conviction or the weight of the box sitting between us. Over the next week, we dug into local history, scouring archives and reaching out to anyone who might know something about Eleanor and James. What we found was sparse, just fragments of their story. They had lived in the area nearly a century ago. Eleanor was said to have been a schoolteacher, and James a carpenter who helped build some of the structures that still stood in town. According to an old newspaper clipping, James had died tragically during a construction accident near the river. The clipping included a photograph of a small church on the outskirts of town, its steeple framed against a cloudy sky. The caption read, "James Willard, beloved by Eleanor Hart, laid to rest here." "That's it," Alex said, pointing to the faded image. "That's where we need to go." A few days later, we stood outside the small, weathered church. It was almost picturesque, with its peeling white paint and overgrown graveyard. But as we stepped through the gates, a strange heaviness settled over us. We found James's grave near the back, a simple headstone marked with his name and the dates of his birth and death. There was no mention of Eleanor, no indication that she had ever been laid to rest beside him. Alex knelt, placing the rusted box at the base of the headstone. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air was still, almost reverent. "She can rest now," Alex said softly, almost to himself. We stood there for a while, letting the quiet envelop us. And then, as we turned to leave, a gust of wind swept through the graveyard, carrying with it a faint, familiar scent like wildflowers after a storm. In the days that followed, life began to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after what we'd experienced. We didn't talk about the bridge or the letters again, though I often caught Alex lost in thought, his brow furrowed as if trying to piece together something elusive. Jake seemed to move on the fastest, throwing himself into work and cracking jokes that felt forced. Mark, on the other hand, grew quieter, more withdrawn. And me? I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of something far greater than we could understand. Was Eleanor truly at peace now? Or had we simply played a part in something we couldn't fully grasp? One night, weeks after we'd left the box at James' grave, I found myself dreaming of the bridge again. The tapping sound echoed in my ears, and I saw her Eleanor standing just beyond the edge of the candlelight. But this time, her face was calm, almost serene. When I woke, the dream lingered, vivid and sharp. I couldn't help but wonder if it was her way of saying goodbye. The bridge still stands, of course, a silent sentinel over the river. People still talk about it, the stories passed down like urban legends. But for me, for us, it's no longer just a ghost story. It's a part of us now, etched into our lives like the grooves in the old wooden planks. And maybe, just maybe, that's how it was meant to be. The bridge still stands, its worn timbers stretching over the quiet river, surrounded by the whisper of rustling leaves and the occasional distant bird call. It feels unchanged, as though frozen in time, oblivious to the lives it has touched and the stories it has claimed. Months have passed, and life has crept back toward normalcy. The days are filled with the routine of work, errands, and the comforting rhythm of everyday life. Yet every now and then, in the quiet moments, the memories return. They come unbidden fragments of that night on the bridge, the letters, and Eleanor's piercing, sorrowful eyes. I found myself thinking about her story, the loneliness she must have endured, and the love that remained her tether to this world even after death. It's strange, really, to feel such empathy for a spirit, a presence we barely understood. But what we encountered wasn't just about fear or the supernatural, it was about human connection. Even in death, Eleanor sought to be heard, to share her grief and her longing. Perhaps we weren't the heroes of the story, but merely witnesses. And maybe that's all she needed, someone to see her, to acknowledge her pain, and to carry her memory forward. The group doesn't talk much about what happened anymore. Alex, the most affected, still visits the old church occasionally, leaving flowers at James's grave. He never says much about why, but I think it brings him peace, or at least a sense of closure. Jake, ever the skeptic, has returned to his usual self, though he avoids the bridge now. If anyone brings it up, he laughs it off, making light of the experience as though it was all just a bad dream. But I've caught him glancing at dark corners, his jovial mask slipping for just a moment before he brushes it away. Mark has grown quieter, more introspective. He used to be the life of our group, always ready with a sarcastic comment or a joke. Now, he seems weighed down by something he can't quite express. I think he carries the most questions about that night, and maybe even a tinge of guilt, though for what, I don't know. As for me, I've found a strange sense of gratitude amidst the fear and confusion. It's not every day you come face to face with something beyond explanation. It reminds you of the fragility of life, the mysteries that lie just beyond the veil of what we call reality. And while I wouldn't wish to relive those moments, I wouldn't erase them either. The bridge has become more than just a local legend to us. It's a place we avoid yet can't entirely leave behind. On some level, it feels like it belongs to us now, as if we've become part of its story just as much as it became part of ours. The locals still talk about it, spinning tales of ghostly encounters and eerie whispers in the night. Some claim to have seen the flickering of candles on the water, while others speak of tapping sounds that echo through the stillness. They don't know what we know, but perhaps that's for the best. We've never told anyone the full story. It feels too personal, too intimate, something meant to stay between us and Eleanor. Sharing it would strip it of its meaning, reducing it to just another ghost story for thrill seekers to chase. It was a chilly autumn evening when I first heard about the house on the hill. My friends and I, all in our early 20s, were sitting in our favorite corner booth at the diner. The place was buzzing with the usual crowd, locals sipping coffee, catching up on the day's news, and the occasional trucker passing through. The hum of conversations filled the air, creating a sense of normalcy that made the upcoming events feel even more unsettling in hindsight. I looked around at my friends, all of them lost in the comforting routine of late-night snacks and easy banter. There was Ben, always the loudest in the group, his laughter echoing across the table as he recounted a story about a recent fishing trip. Then there was Kyle, a quiet and thoughtful guy who mostly kept to himself but had this intensity about him when something piqued his interest. To my right sat Ava, who could always be counted on for her quick wit, keeping us entertained no matter what. And finally, there was me, Mark, the one who usually stayed in the background, content with listening to my friends and occasionally chiming in when the moment felt right. Life had been pretty ordinary up until that night. We were all in college, juggling studies, part-time jobs, and the usual mix of young adult chaos. But there was always this craving for something more. Something beyond the walls of the campus, beyond the parties and mundane routines we had fallen into. We were looking for a thrill, something to break the monotony. And that's when the conversation shifted. Ben had brought it up casually, as though it was just another one of his wild ideas, but it caught my attention. He'd heard from one of his cousins about our houses on the outskirts of town. Not just any house, an old, abandoned house that had been sitting there for decades. It was a dilapidated, decaying structure perched on a hill, far enough away from town that no one really bothered with it. Rumor had it that the place was haunted, that strange things happened there, that the people who lived there had just disappeared. "Come on, guys," Ben urged, a mischievous grin playing at the corners of his mouth. "What's the worst that could happen? We go check it out, maybe take a few pictures, and be back before midnight." Kyle didn't say much at first, but I could tell he was intrigued. He wasn't the type to entertain things like ghost stories or spooky rumors, but there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't ready to dismiss this one just yet. Ava, on the other hand, wasn't so easily convinced. She was the pragmatic one, always questioning things before jumping in. "What if it's dangerous?" she asked, tapping her fingers on the table. "You know, there's probably a good reason it's been abandoned all these years." But Ben wasn't having it. "It's just an old house," he said. "Besides, think of the stories we'll have to tell. A little adventure never hurt anyone." And just like that, the idea took root. The more we talked about it, the more it sounded like the perfect plan for a Friday night. After all, who doesn't want a little excitement? We all agreed that we'd go. It was the kind of decision you make without really thinking it through, but by the time we left the diner, it felt like we had already committed to something bigger than we anticipated. The drive out to the house wasn't long, but it was enough time for the excitement to build. The further we got from the town, the darker it seemed to get. The trees lining the road grew thicker, casting long shadows on the pavement. The occasional house we passed was either abandoned or dark, adding to the eerie feeling creeping over us. As we turned off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path leading up the hill, I could feel my pulse quicken. The air had gotten colder, and a sense of unease settled over me, though I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to back out now. When we finally reached the top of the hill, I could see the outline of the houses in the distance. It was even worse than I had imagined. The roof sagged in places, and vines crept up the sides like a slow-moving infection. The windows were either boarded up or shattered, and the whole house had an air of neglect, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. "Well, here we are," Ben said, his voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Let's go see what's inside." Ava shot him a skeptical look. "I'm not sure about this." But Kyle had already opened the car door and stepped out, his face a mask of curiosity. Ava sighed but followed him, and I followed them both, trying to suppress the growing feeling in the pit of my stomach. As we walked toward the house, the crunch of leaves and twigs under our feet seemed unnaturally loud. The winds howled in the trees, but otherwise, the place was eerily silent. The closer we got, the more I felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on us. We reached the front porch, where the wooden steps creaked under our weight. There was no turning back now. Ben reached for the doorknob, and with a single twist, the door swung open with a loud groan. The darkness inside was absolute. Even though the sun had only just set, it felt as if no light had ever reached into this house. Ben stepped inside first, flashlight in hand, and the rest of us followed. The air was thick with dust, and it smelled musty, like something had been dead and rotting for years. It didn't take long for us to realize that the house was more than just abandoned. It was forgotten, left behind as though the people who lived there had simply vanished. But we were still too caught up in the thrill of the moment to understand what was about to unfold. We had just stepped over the threshold into the dark, dusty interior of the house. The air was thick, stale with the smell of mold and rotting wood, and each of us instinctively wrinkled our noses. The flashlight beams from Ben's handheld light cut through the pitch-black gloom, illuminating the abandoned space one flicker at a time. The floorboards beneath our feet creaked with every step, echoing through the empty houses. The house was silent, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The rooms were bare, save for the odd forgotten furniture that had been left behind, a rusted chair here, a shattered mirror there. The kind of things you'd expect to find in a place that had been long neglected. I remember feeling this strange combination of curiosity and unease. Part of me was still thrilled by the adventure. The other part, the one I kept buried deep, was growing more and more uncomfortable as we explored further into the house. It was as if the house itself was alive in some twisted way, and it was watching us. "Let's check out the upstairs," Ben said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hallway. Without hesitation, he started toward the staircase, and the rest of us followed. The steps groaned beneath our weight, and the closer we got to the top, the more I felt a creeping sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the darkness, the isolation. It had been a long day, after all. But something wasn't right. When we reached the top of the stairs, the hallway split in two directions. One way led to a darkened bedroom with a torn, moth-eaten curtain hanging from the window. The other opened into what looked like an old study, the walls lined with shelves that had long since been emptied. Ben was the first to enter the bedroom. He swept his flashlight across the floor and laughed, his voice unnervingly loud in the silence. "This place is a dump. What kind of people lived here?" Ava, who had been hanging back, didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on something in the far corner of the room, something I couldn't quite see at first. She took a step closer, her expression unreadable, and I could feel a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden drop in temperature that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What's wrong?" Kyle asked, noticing her hesitation. He walked over to her side and looked where she was staring. I followed suit, and that's when I saw it, a faint outline, barely visible against the wall. A shadow. But it wasn't like the shadows cast by the flashlight. This one seemed to move, as if it were shifting in a way that didn't match the position of our light. Ava's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back. "Did you see that?" We all fell silent. Ben, still too caught up in the excitement, waved it off. "It's just the light, Ava. This place is falling apart. We probably just saw a shadow from something outside, but I wasn't so sure. The more I looked at the spot, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a trick of the light. That shadow had depth, something about it felt wrong." We stood there for a few moments, The only sound, the faint echo of our breathing in the otherwise silent room. But then, something else caught our attention. A creak. Not from the floor beneath our feet, but from somewhere deeper inside the house. A distinct sound, almost like a door slowly being pushed open. Ava turned quickly, her eyes wide, but there was nothing in the hallway behind us. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded, a strange unease creeping over us. Ben, ever the one to try to maintain control, waved it off again. "It's just the houses settling. You know, old houses do that." But I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't just the houses settling, it felt like something, or someone, was moving within these walls. Without saying a word, Kyle started walking toward the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from deeper in the houses, past the rooms we had already explored. He moved cautiously, his flashlight now sweeping the darkened hall in front of him. "Wait up," Ben called, but Kyle didn't answer. There was something in his posture, something in the way he walked, that told me he was just as uneasy as the rest of us. He was simply trying to push through it, maybe hoping that by continuing forward, whatever was happening would make more sense. I glanced at Ava, who seemed to be struggling with something in her own mind. She shook her head, almost as if she were trying to convince herself that everything was fine. I could see it on her face, though. She was scared. We all followed Kyle, our steps tentative, as we ventured further into the houses. The deeper we went, the colder it seemed to get. The temperature was dropping, and with it, the tension among us grew thicker. When we reached the end of the hallway, we found ourselves facing a door. It was slightly ajar, and the dark interior beyond seemed to beckon us. The creak we had heard earlier seemed to have come from behind it. I felt the hairs on my neck prickle again. This time, I didn't try to ignore it. Ben pushed the door open all the way, and we stepped inside. The room was small, nothing more than a storage space, filled with old boxes, dust, and the unmistakable scent of mildew. But what caught my eye wasn't the room itself. It was the chair. The chair in the corner of the room was facing the wall. At first, it seemed like an ordinary chair, a rickety old thing. But as we stepped further inside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The chair was slightly rocking. Not much, but enough to be noticeable. I glanced around at the others. Ben, still oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere, laughed. "This is ridiculous. We're scaring ourselves over nothing." But his words didn't ease the tension. The creaking chair was just the beginning. We stayed in the room for only a few moments before we heard it again, a soft shuffle. It was coming from behind us. A cold gust of winds blew through the room, slamming the door shut behind us with a loud bang. It wasn't the winds, it was too sudden, too forceful. We froze. "What was that?" Ava whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide with fear. Before anyone could respond, a low, guttural noise echoed from the far corner of the room, the kind of noise that made my blood run cold. It wasn't human. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The others followed quickly, the sound of their footsteps matching the frantic pace of my own. We didn't stop until we were outside, standing on the porch, gasping for air. The houses loomed in front of us, dark and silent once again. The world felt different now, darker, more oppressive. No one spoke at first. We all just stood there, processing what had happened. But one thing was clear. We were not alone in that house. The night air was cold as we stood outside the houses, still trying to catch our breath. Our minds were racing, trying to piece together what we had just experienced. The sounds, the rocking chair, that thing in the corner of the room, it felt too real to be a trick of the mind. But what could it be? The house was empty. There was no one there. Was there? I felt a knot in my stomach as I stared up at the dilapidated building. The porch creaked under our feet, and for a moment, I almost expected to hear the door creak open again, inviting us back inside. But none of us spoke. No one moved, as if we were all afraid that making the slightest sound would provoke whatever it was that had just terrorized us. Finally, Ben broke the silence. "We're not leaving. Not yet." His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed him. There was a flicker of doubt there. I shook my head, uncertain of what I wanted to do. Part of me wanted to leave, wanted to get as far away from this place as possible. But another part, a stubborn part, refused to be beaten by whatever fear we were all feeling. "We have to figure out what's going on," I said, my voice low but steady. "I'm not just going to run because of a few weird noises." Ben nodded, and we all turned toward the door again. But this time, we weren't as careless. We moved slowly, each step measured. The door creaked as we pushed it open again, but this time there was no gust of winds. It was as if the house itself had been holding its breath. The hallway stretched before us, darker than before, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The air inside the house felt heavier, colder. It was as though the walls were closing in on us. I could almost feel the house's eyes on me, like it was watching, waiting. "Let's stick together," Ava said quietly, her voice trembling. "No one split off this time." "Agreed," Kyle muttered, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting something to appear from the shadows. We slowly made our way back to the staircase, each of us taking turns shining the flashlight ahead of us, our hearts beating faster with every step. The houses felt different now, alive, almost. The beams of light from the flashlights cut through the darkness in jagged slices, but the deeper we went, the more I felt like there were other eyes watching us from beyond the reach of the light. The first odd thing we noticed was the temperature. It had been cold when we first entered, but now it felt like an unnatural chill, as though the air itself had become colder, thicker. We passed by the bedroom where we had seen the shadow earlier, but it was empty now. The air in there felt stale, almost suffocating. I noticed a strange smell then, a metallic scent, like blood, hanging faintly in the air. It made my stomach turn, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. The others seemed to notice it too. Kyle stopped and sniffed the air, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. "Yeah, what is that?" Ben, ever the skeptic, waved it off. "It's probably just mold or something. Old houses smell weird." But I wasn't so sure. It wasn't the same musty smell that had greeted us when we first entered. This was something darker, something more foreboding. We continued down the hallway, moving cautiously toward the study room we had passed earlier. It was as if we were drawn to it, as if the house itself was pulling us back in. When we reached the door, I hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The door was slightly ajar, just like it had been when we first arrived. But this time, the air around it felt wrong. The chill was sharper, the shadows deeper. "Should we go in?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. We all exchanged nervous glances. None of us had the courage to speak our fears aloud, but we all felt it, the growing sense that whatever was inside that room wasn't something we could easily explain away. But we had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Ben pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room was exactly as it had been before, dusty, with broken furniture scattered around. But something was different this time. There was a faint scraping sound coming from the far corner of the room, like something dragging across the floor. We all froze, and my blood ran cold. It was as though time had stopped, and the sound was the only thing that existed in that moment. Then, without warning, the light flickered, and just like that, it was gone. The room was plunged into darkness. Ava gasped, and I heard the distinct sound of her stumbling backward. I reached out to steady her, but my hand passed through empty air. Panic shot through me, and I reached for my flashlight, fumbling to turn it back on. The beam of light finally flickered to life, casting an eerie glow across the room. But what I saw made my heart stop. The chair in the corner, the one that had been facing the wall earlier, was now facing us. And the figure sitting in it. It wasn't one of us. The figure was hunched over, its body thin and gaunt. The face was obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the feeling of being watched, of being preyed upon. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to contract around me, and I felt as if the walls were closing in, suffocating me. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. Then the scraping sound returned. It was louder now, closer, and I turned to see the figure in the chair slowly rise to its feet. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it was fighting against the very air itself. "Get out!" Ava screamed, her voice raw with terror. She grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. But the figure was already moving toward us, its limbs twisted and contorted in a way that no human body should move. We bolted for the door, but the houses seemed to shift around us. The hallway stretched on forever, the shadows growing longer with every step. I could hear the figure behind us, its footsteps slow but deliberate, each one heavy with purpose. We reached the stairs, but the door at the bottom slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping us inside. I turned, panic surging through me, but there was no escape. The air felt thick with dread as we looked around, trying to find a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The houses had us trapped. And that was when the whispers started. The houses felt alive in a way that was almost suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside, seemed to be part of something much larger than just a dilapidated, forgotten building. The air was thick with something darker than dust, something that made my chest tighten and my skin crawl. Our breaths came in shallow, quick bursts as we tried to catch our bearings. I couldn't shake the feeling that the houses was aware of us, watching, waiting. It was as though we were intruders in a place that had been waiting for us all along. We stood together in the dim hallway, huddled close, our bodies tense with terror. The figure from the study room was still on our minds, but the longer we stayed inside, the more real it became. It wasn't a figment of our imagination. Whatever it wasn't human, and it was hunting us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we stood, frozen, facing the staircase that had once seemed like an escape route. The stairs now felt like a trap. They loomed above us, twisting higher into the darkness, and I was convinced that if we climbed them, we wouldn't be able to come back down. There was something up there, something we hadn't seen yet. But at the same time, I knew we had no choice. The door had slammed shut, blocking our only way out. "We need to get out of here," Ben said, his voice a shaky whisper. He was the first to speak since the door had slammed, and his words were laced with fear. His usually confident demeanor had disappeared, replaced by a desperation that none of us had seen before. I nodded, my throat dry. "But how? The door's locked. We're trapped in here." Kyle was pacing now, his flashlight flicking nervously around the room, as though searching for something, anything that could help us. "Maybe there's another way out, a back door, a window, anything. We have to move." But I knew, deep down, that there was no way out. The houses had already made its decision. We were not meant to leave. The air felt colder as we inched toward the stairs, the silence almost unbearable. The only sound was our own breathing, heavy and strained. I could feel my hands trembling as I reached for the banister, the wood rough under my fingers, but it didn't matter. We had no choice but to go up. We had to face whatever was waiting for us, even if it was more terrifying than we could possibly imagine. We climbed the stairs one at a time, each step seeming to echo louder than the last. The houses creaked and groaned under our weight, but it felt as though the noise was only amplifying the tension that hung between us. We had no idea what we were walking into. As we reached the top of the stairs, a sudden sharp sound broke through the quiet, a loud bang, followed by a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. It was coming from the room at the end of the hall. The one that had once been locked, the one that we hadn't dared approach. I froze, my entire body stiff with fear. The others stopped as well, their faces pale in the weak light of our flashlights. I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear I felt gripping me from the inside out. "What was that?" Ava whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I could barely breathe. The growl was unmistakable. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything we had ever encountered before. And it was getting closer. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hall burst open, the force of it slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. I flinched, my heart racing. The light from our flashlights flickered, and for a split second, the room seemed to darken even further. Then, in that moment of absolute horror, I saw it. The figure was standing there in the doorway. But it wasn't just standing, it was moving, crawling toward us on all fours. Its body was twisted, contorted in ways that were impossible. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at unnatural angles. And its face. I couldn't look at it for long. The eyes were black, wide and empty, staring straight through us. Its mouth was open in a grin that stretched far too wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and jagged, like those of some predatory animal. The growl grew louder, and the thing moved closer. It didn't make a sound as it crawled, just the rustling of its unnatural movements. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I couldn't make a sound. My body was paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. It was like every part of me knew that I was looking at something not of this world, something that had been waiting for us, watching us for so long. Ben was the first to react. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Ava's arm, pulling her backward, urging us to run. But we didn't have time. The thing lunged, its body moving with terrifying speed, and it was on us before we could react. I felt the coldness of its breath on my neck, and for a moment, I thought it was all over. Its hands, if you could even call them hands, gripped my shoulders with a force that felt like it could crush bone. I turned to face it, my heart hammering in my chest, and for a moment, our eyes locked. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. But then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, it released me. I stumbled backward, falling into Kyle, who was already scrambling toward the stairs. The thing hissed, a sound that sent a chill through my bones, before it turned and retreated into the darkness of the hallway. We didn't wait. We didn't question it. We ran. The houses seemed to resist us now, as though it was fighting against our every move. The door at the bottom of the stairs had somehow opened, but the stairs themselves were nearly impossible to climb. The walls seemed to press in on us, and the stairs creaked under our weight like they might collapse at any moment. I heard Ava scream behind me, and I turned just in time to see her trip and fall. Kyle reached out to grab her, but his hand missed, and she tumbled backward. I screamed her name, but the words barely escaped my throat. She didn't get up. The thing was back. It had her. I wanted to stop, to go back, but Ben grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. "We can't help her. We have to go." It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but we kept running. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the front door. I flung it open with all my strength, and we spilled out into the night, gasping for air, the cool breeze hitting our faces like a slap of reality. We were outside. We were free. But I couldn't forget the image of her face, frozen in fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The house had released us. Yes, but there was something else. Something that had been there before we arrived, and would be there long after we were gone. The cool night air felt almost too calm as we stood outside the abandoned houses, our bodies shaking uncontrollably. The weight of the darkness around us felt like it was closing in, even though we had escaped. Ben, Kyle, and I huddled together, our breaths ragged and uneven. The silence of the night was broken only by the faint rustling of the leaves in the trees, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt ominous, like the houses were still watching us, waiting for the next move. We didn't speak at first. None of us knew what to say. The horror of what we just experienced still clung to our senses like a thick fog. The images of that thing, its twisted, contorted body, and its soulless, black eyes were burned into my mind. The feeling of it gripping me, cold and strong, still sent shivers down my spine. "We should call the cops," Kyle finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But the way he said it made it sound like a suggestion he wasn't even sure he believed in. He had a faraway look in his eyes, as if he wasn't fully present, his mind still trapped in the nightmare we'd just escaped. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "They won't believe us. They'll think we're just kids making up stories. They wouldn't understand." Ben looked at me, his face pale under the moonlight. "You think they'd think we're lying?" I didn't answer. What could I say? How could I explain to anyone that there was something beyond human, something that had been waiting for us inside that house, something that had nearly claimed us? The fear still gripped my chest, even as we stood safely outside. But something else had begun to creep in a strange, unsettling emptiness. We had made it out, but at what cost? Ava. She hadn't made it. I couldn't stop thinking about her face, her scream. The image of her falling behind us, helpless, still haunted me. "Do you think she's—" Kyle started, but he didn't finish the sentence. None of us wanted to admit what we already knew. Ben's voice broke through the silence. "We should go back. We can't just leave her." I looked at him, startled. "What? Are you crazy? We can't go back in there. It's over. Whatever is in that house, it's not something we can fight." "But she's gone, man," Ben said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We owe her at least that. We need to make sure she's—" "We don't owe it to her," I snapped, the words coming out harsher than I meant. "We don't owe anyone anything. She's—" But I couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of returning to that house was too much to bear. My body was still trembling from the fear, and my mind couldn't focus. What could we possibly do? What was left to resolve? The house had shown us its worst, and we had barely survived. I turned away, shaking my head. "We need to get as far away from here as possible." Kyle nodded silently, his expression grim. Ben remained quiet for a moment longer, but he finally relented, his shoulders slumping with defeat. We had all seen the same thing, the same impossible, monstrous entity. There was no fighting it. There was no going back in. Without another word, we began to walk away from the house, our steps heavy and slow. The air felt thick around us, suffocating, as though the house was unwilling to let us leave. Every step we took away from it felt like we were being pulled back, like something invisible was trying to drag us back inside. But we didn't stop. We kept moving, not daring to look over our shoulders. As we walked, my mind kept replaying the scene over and over again. The creature, the way it had moved, the way it had gotten so close to us. It was hard to grasp that something so inhuman had been real, but I knew it was. And I knew it hadn't let us leave just out of mercy. It had let us go because it had gotten what it wanted Ava. And maybe, in some twisted way, it had been toying with us, giving us just enough hope to believe we could escape before ripping that hope away. The road ahead of us felt long, but none of us spoke. We didn't have the energy to talk. The events that had unfolded felt too surreal, too horrifying to process. The weight of it was too much to bear. When we reached the edge of the woods, we paused for a moment, staring back at the houses, now barely visible in the distance. It stood there like a silent sentinel, its windows dark, its walls crumbling and decayed. But even from here, I could feel its presence. It wasn't just a house. It was something else. Something old. Something that had been there long before we arrived and would remain long after we left. "What do we do now?" Kyle asked, breaking the silence. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to say. We couldn't go back, and we couldn't just forget what had happened. It would follow us. It would always follow us. The house had made sure of that. "We need to forget about it," Ben said, finally breaking his silence. His voice was hollow, but it held a strange finality. "We need to let it go. For Ava." But even as he said the words, I knew we couldn't. Not really. Not after what we had seen. We kept walking, though none of us were sure what the future held. The world outside seemed normal, almost too normal. The stars in the sky above us looked the same, the air felt the same, and the sounds of the night were unchanged. But I knew that wasn't true. Everything had changed. The houses had changed us. It had shown us something darker than we could ever comprehend, and there was no going back. As we reached the main road, we didn't look at each other. We just kept walking. Our shoes slapped against the pavement, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. But in my mind, I could still hear the growl of that creature. I could still see Ava's terrified face as it dragged her away. We weren't free. Not really. We would never be free. And as we walked away from the houses that would forever haunt our nightmares, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever evil resided there, it hadn't been satisfied with just Ava. It had let us go, but it wouldn't forget us. And one day, it would come for us again. Months have passed since that night, but the images still linger in my mind like shadows that never quite fade. Sometimes, I'll wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and for a moment, I'll swear I hear the creaking of the old house's floorboards beneath me. I don't think any of us were truly prepared for the psychological toll that experience would have on us. We survived the house, but in many ways, it still haunts us. Ben moved away soon after. He said he needed a fresh start, a new place, a place where the memories wouldn't follow him. I couldn't blame him. Kyle and I stayed, both of us too afraid to leave the town we knew, even though the memories of that night had become a constant, knowing presence in our minds. There were days when we could almost pretend everything was normal. Days when the sky seemed just a little bit brighter and the world felt less suffocating. But those days were few and always followed by nights when I'd lay awake, eyes wide open, hearing every sound, fearing every shadow. I sometimes wonder if that house is still there, if it still waits, just as it waited for us. Did we really escape, or was it simply letting us go, knowing that we would never truly be free? There are whispers around town, of course. Some say the house is cursed, that it's the site of some dark ritual, that it was built over an old burial ground. But those are just stories. No one knows the truth, and maybe no one wants to. The fewer people who ask, the better. But there are things I know for sure. Ben never came back. Not once. He's gone. Kyle, too, started to change after that night. He's quieter now, distant. I see it in his eyes, the same shadow that clings to me. He's afraid, and I can't blame him. We all are. I don't know what happened to Ava. Maybe we'll never know. The house acclaimed her, took her, and it's as if she never existed. There are no records of her ever being reported missing, no mention of her in the news, no sign of her in town. It's like the world forgot about her the moment she was dragged into that dark place. And I suppose, in a way, that's what terrifies me most of all. How many others have vanished into the houses? How many have walked in, only to never be seen again? The more I think about it, the more I wonder if that thing, whatever it was, had been around longer than we realized. Maybe it was just waiting for the right moment, for the right people, to walk in and make the mistake of thinking they could leave. I haven't been back to that place. I don't think I ever will. Some part of me wonders if we should have gone back for Ava. But I know the answer. We wouldn't have stood a chance. The houses had already made its choice. It took her for a reason. And maybe it was always meant to take her, and we were just too blinded by our own fear to realize it until it was too late. Even now, I wonder if the house still has a hold on me. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I'll hear a faint noise almost like a whisper on the winds, or maybe just a creak from the floor beneath me. It's the kind of sound that makes your skin crawl, the kind that makes you question whether or not you're alone. I don't know if it's real or if it's just the lingering effects of what happened, but every time I hear it, I freeze, heart pounding, waiting for the house to come for me too. I've told myself it's just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I know the truth. The house isn't done with us. It might have let us go, but I can feel its presence even now. Watching, waiting, as if it's simply biding its time until it's ready to strike again. The nightmares don't help. They've gotten worse over the months. I see it sometimes, the houses looming in the darkness, its broken windows watching me, its door creaking open as if it knows I'm coming. And then, when I step inside, I can feel it. The thing we couldn't see, the thing that had been waiting for us the whole time, is there. I can hear its breathing, slow and steady, and I know, deep down, that it's going to come for me next. But that's the thing about fear, isn't it? It never really goes away. It settles in, becomes part of you. And once you've seen something like that, something so beyond human understanding, it changes you. You don't go back to being the person you were before. You live with it. The memories, the fear, the knowledge that there are things out there, things waiting that no one will ever be able to explain. As for the others, I don't know what happened to them. Kyle rarely answers my calls now, and when he does, his voice is different, hollow, as though a part of him left with the house. Then disappeared entirely. I heard rumors he left the state, but I never heard from him again. It's like the houses has a way of drawing people in and then making them disappear when they've outlived their usefulness. As for me, I try to move on. I try to forget the houses, forget what we saw. But every now and then, when the wind is just right, I feel the chill and I remember. And I know deep down that no matter how far I go, no matter how much time passes, the house is still out there. It's still waiting. And one day, it will come for me, just like it came for her. Just like it came for us all. It was late autumn, a time of year when the air feels crisp, the days are shorter, and the nights stretch on, long and quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder what's just outside of your vision, waiting to move when the darkness falls. It was exactly that kind of evening when I found myself alone, in a small, quiet hotel tucked away off the main road, far from the bustle of city life. I had just finished a long day of driving, making my way through the fading light of the day. A quick stop at this unassuming place seemed like a good way to recharge, get a good night's sleep, and be on my way in the morning. The hotel had an old-world charm to it, dark wood paneling, antique furniture, and a low, comfortable hum of a space frozen in time. The kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. As I walked into the lobby, I noticed the faint smell of musty wood mixed with a slight hint of something floral, almost too sweet. The dim lighting made the room feel cozy, even though there were only a few guests milling about. The receptionist, a woman with graying hair and a soft smile, greeted me warmly. She checked me in without a hitch, handing me the key to my room with a polite nod. Room 204. A simple number, nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing, in fact, seemed odd at all. The kind of place you'd expect to stay in after a long day of travel. The hallway was narrow, lined with thick carpeting that muffled my footsteps as I walked down toward my room. The walls, adorned with framed pictures of landscapes and old black and white photos, felt like they were telling a story of the hotel's long history. It wasn't a grand building, but it had an undeniable comfort about it. The kind of place that made you feel like you were being taken care of, tucked into a corner where the world couldn't quite touch you. As I unlocked the door to my room, I couldn't help but smile at how simple and inviting it was. A small desk, a bed with soft, inviting blankets, and a window that looked out over a quiet street. It was exactly what I needed. After a quick shower, I settled into the bed, the soft sheets immediately comforting me as I closed my eyes. The hum of the hotel was calming, almost like a lullaby. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, not a sound, not a smell, not a sight. It was just an impression, one of those feelings you get when you walk into a room and know, deep down, that things might not be quite as they seem. I shrugged it off. I was tired after all. The kind of exhaustion that only a long drive can create. As I lay there in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, I let myself drift into sleep, my mind still buzzing with thoughts of the day. It was then that I noticed the silence. A deep, almost unnerving silence that filled the room. No distant sounds of traffic, no hum of the heating system. Just a stillness so thick it felt as though the air had stopped moving altogether. It wasn't a comforting silence, it was the kind of silence that makes you feel small, as though you're the only one in the world, and perhaps that's not a good thing. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I had a long day ahead of me tomorrow. So I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and finally allowed sleep to take over. At least, that's how I thought the night would go. The night had been still, peaceful even, as I drifted into sleep. The weight of the long day pressed down on me, making my eyelids heavy, my body sinking into the mattress, and the world outside my room gradually fading away. But that peace didn't last long. I woke up suddenly, eyes snapping open as if something had pulled me from my dreams. At first, I wasn't sure what had happened. The room was as it had been before, dimly lit by the bedside lamp, the curtains gently swaying with the breeze from the cracked window, the sound of the old building settling into the night. The same stillness that had initially unsettled me now felt oddly familiar, like I was still in a place I knew well. But there was something else. A faint sound. It was almost imperceptible at first, just a soft thud, like a door closing gently somewhere far away. I blinked, unsure of where it had come from. I could hear nothing else. The hum of the hotel's old plumbing, the wind rustling outside, but nothing that would explain the noise. I brushed it off. Perhaps the building was just old, creaking in its own way. Maybe it was the wind pushing a door somewhere down the hall. There were plenty of explanations, all of them logical and easy to dismiss. So I turned over, pulled the blanket tighter around me, and tried to drift back to sleep. But then the sound came again. Louder this time, unmistakable. A knock. It wasn't a soft knock, like someone at the door, but a sharp, deliberate sound, as though someone was tapping something against the wall. It was rhythmic, almost too precise to be an accident. I froze, lying completely still, listening. My heartbeat quickened, but I didn't move. I wasn't sure what to do. It had to be a mistake, someone knocking on the door, right? But that didn't make sense. I hadn't heard anyone else moving about in the hallway. The hotel was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I sat up slowly, the bed creaking beneath me. There was no one at the door. No one in the hallway either. I pressed my ear to the cold wood of the doorframe, straining to hear, but all I could hear was the steady beat of my own pulse. I didn't want to check. I was afraid to check. The silence that followed felt too heavy, too thick, as though something was waiting just beyond my line of sight. I glanced over at the window. The faint streetlight outside cast long shadows into the room, but there was no movement outside. The night was still, almost painfully so. The tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. I could feel it reverberating through the walls. I didn't understand. I was certain no one was there. No one could have been. The hotel was empty aside from a few guests who had checked in earlier, all tucked away in their rooms for the night. I stood up, my feet hitting the cold floor with a soft thud. My heart raced. What could it be? I hesitated for a moment before I grabbed the handle of the door and opened it. There was nothing in the hallway. Nothing but the dull light from the few lamps that dotted the walls and the thick carpeting beneath my feet. No one. No noise. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and stepped back inside my room. It was then that I noticed something else, something that hadn't been there before. The window. It was wide open. I didn't remember opening it. In fact, I was certain I had closed it before going to bed. The breeze that flowed in was cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the room. My stomach twisted. The window, the sound, the knocking, it all felt wrong. I walked over to the window, trying to make sense of what had happened. The breeze ruffled the curtains, but the street outside was still. I could hear nothing except for the wind, which now seemed to be picking up ever so slightly. I closed the window, locking it firmly in place, and stood there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. It had to be the wind, or perhaps the building settling in a way that made the noise seem closer than it really was. But something about it still didn't sit right with me. I went back to bed, feeling a tightness in my chest. The bed felt colder now, somehow, and the weight of the blankets didn't seem as comforting as it had earlier. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come back. But it didn't. The silence had returned, and with it, a feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything specific, nothing I could see or touch, but the air in the room felt heavier, thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. The hours passed slowly, every minute stretching longer than the last. Every little creak of the building, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. And then, just as I was about to fall back into a restless sleep, I heard it again. A sound so subtle, so soft, it was almost like a whisper in the back of my mind. A faint, rhythmic tapping. This time, it came from the corner of the room. I froze. The room was completely still, and yet I could hear it, like a faint knock or tap, each one coming with a deliberate pause in between. My blood ran cold. I wasn't sure what to do. The sound grew louder, more distinct, but still not enough to pinpoint its exact source. I slowly turned my head, trying to peer into the darkness. The corner of the room was shrouded in shadow. Nothing moved, but the sound. It continued. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening. I couldn't understand what was happening. Was I imagining it? Was I just tired? I glanced over at the window. It was closed tightly, locked. No breeze. Nothing out of the ordinary. The tapping continued, growing louder and closer, as though it was right there, in the room with me. My skin prickled. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat was dry. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot. The room felt smaller now, suffocating even. My heart pounded in my chest, but still I could not move. The sound stopped abruptly. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining the whole thing. The room was completely still again, eerily quiet. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my hands trembled as I reached for the bedside lamp, clicking it on with a soft click. The light flooded the room, chasing the shadows back into the corners. Nothing. The room was empty. The window was closed. The tapping was gone. I told myself it was nothing, just a bad dream, or perhaps the building settling again. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something had changed in that room. Something I couldn't explain. But there was no way I was leaving now. No way I was going to let this place win. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. There had to be an explanation. A rational one. And I was going to find it. The next few days felt like a blur. I tried to convince myself that the events of that first night had been a one-off, an unfortunate trick of the mind, or maybe just a result of exhaustion. But as each day passed, I began to realize something. Those little incidents weren't just going away. In fact, they were getting worse. At first, it was subtle. A cold spot in the corner of the room that couldn't be explained, no matter how many times I adjusted the air conditioning. The feeling of being watched, lurking just outside the edges of my awareness, which I tried to dismiss as paranoia. But the sensations persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. It all came to a head on the third night. I had returned from a long day of exploring the nearby town, hoping to take my mind off things. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The hotel felt the same when I returned, still, almost as if time itself had stopped. As I entered my room, the same heavy silence settled over me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the sense of unease was growing by the minute. I tossed my bag onto the bed and went to close the window, the slight breeze from earlier still making the curtains sway. When I turned around, I noticed something that immediately made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The closet door was slightly ajar. It wasn't open by much, but enough for me to notice. I was certain I had closed it earlier. I had made a point to, in fact, after unpacking my things. But there it was, that crack in the door, just wide enough for the shadows to sneak through. The air in the room felt heavier as I walked over to the closet, my heart beating faster with each step. I reached for the handle and pulled it open. Nothing was inside. At least, that's what I told myself. The space was empty, the clothes I had hung up neatly arranged, and there was nothing out of place. Still, that creeping feeling in my gut didn't let up. I slammed the door shut with a force I hadn't intended, my breath quickening. I shook my head, trying to clear the tension. It was just the nerves, just my mind playing tricks on me again. But even as I thought that, the room seemed colder. The lights flickered slightly, just once, enough to make me look up in confusion. The air felt thick now, dense with something I couldn't place. I turned the lights up higher, trying to push the feeling away, but the sense of discomfort remained. I sat on the bed, staring at the door for what felt like an eternity. The world outside felt miles away, and I couldn't shake the idea that something was watching me from within the shadows. Something that I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. Then it started again. A tap. I froze. The sound came from somewhere to my right, somewhere near the wall. It was faint at first, just a soft, rhythmic knock, but this time it was different. It wasn't a distant tap like before. It was closer. So close, in fact, that I could feel the vibrations in the floorboards beneath me. It was coming from inside the room, from somewhere I couldn't identify. I slowly stood up, trying to control my breathing, but the knock came again, louder now, with an undeniable sense of urgency. I stepped forward, feeling the cold air crawl up my skin, and approached the source of the noise. The walls seemed to close in around me, the room shrinking with each step. I reached the far corner where I thought the sound had originated. I reached out slowly, my fingers brushing against the wall. The texture was rough, almost as if the plaster had worn away from years of use. But then, just as I was about to pull my hand back, I noticed something else. There was an indentation in the wall, a small, barely noticeable mark just above eye level. I pushed against it and it gave way, shifting slightly under the pressure of my palm. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking had stopped, but something else had begun, the unmistakable sound of a faint, distant whisper, like voices murmuring through the walls. It wasn't words that I could make out, but the tone was enough to send a chill through my spine. I quickly stepped away from the wall and turned to look around the room. The light from the lamp flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the floor. The whispers grew louder, as if they were calling to me from somewhere deep within the building. I looked to the door, half expecting someone to be standing in the hallway, but the silence was deafening. Then, something caught my eye. The mirror on the far side of the room, one that I had barely noticed before, now reflected a faint, shifting shape. It wasn't my own reflection. I knew that much immediately. There was something moving in the glass, something that didn't belong. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I walked over to the mirror, my steps slow and deliberate, my heart racing in my chest. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cool surface of the glass, but as soon as my hand made contact, a sharp noise erupted from the corner of the room. A loud crash. I spun around, but nothing had fallen. The room was still as ever. No broken glass, no fallen objects, only that feeling of tension in the air, growing thicker, heavier by the second. I didn't know what to do. My body was shaking now, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I needed to leave, but something kept me in place. The feeling that I was being drawn in, that the very air around me was thick with something dark, something that had been waiting for me. The lights flickered again. This time, they didn't stop. And in that moment, I knew. It was no longer just a strange incident or a bad dream. Something was happening here, something I couldn't ignore. Something was trying to make itself known, and it wasn't going to stop. I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk, but the line was dead. No dial tone, no signal, just an oppressive silence. My stomach dropped. Whatever was going on, it wasn't something I could simply explain away. I had to get out. But the door wouldn't open. I turned the handle, but the door was stuck, as though something was holding it closed from the other side. I pushed harder, but the door didn't budge. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away from the door, now feeling completely trapped. The knocking started again, this time from right behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. The whispering had grown louder, more distinct, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. I was no longer alone in the room. Something else was here. Something I could feel in my bones. I ran to the window, but when I tried to open it, the frame was stuck. It wouldn't move. The room felt like it was suffocating me, the air too thick, the pressure too heavy. My head spun, my vision blurred as I desperately searched for a way out. The mirror. That's what I focused on, even though every rational part of me screamed to look away, to turn, to leave. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. In the reflection, I saw it clearly. A figure stood behind me. I didn't need to look back to know that it wasn't human. It wasn't something I could touch or physically feel, but it was there, standing in the mirror, just inches behind me. The figure was tall, its outline blurry, as if it were made of smoke or fog, a dark, shifting shadow against the brightness of the room. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't breathe. The air had grown so thick with fear and tension that my chest felt like it was being crushed under an invisible weight. I could hear the low hum of my own blood pounding in my ears, deafening, and yet the whispers continued, growing louder, almost frantic, urging me to turn around. But I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, rooted to the spot, my legs stiff with terror. The figure in the mirror was no longer an outline. It was more solid now, with dark, hollow eyes staring straight at me. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting, like it had been waiting for me all along. The room felt colder still, the temperature dropping at a rate that made my breath fog up in front of me. I could see the condensation forming on the edges of the mirror, as though the glass itself was breathing. Then the figure in the reflection moved. It was slow at first, so slow that I thought it was a trick of my mind. But then it stepped forward, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor, darkening the space around me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but no words would come. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. A low, guttural sound escaped from the figure's throat, a rasping noise that sent a jolt of pure fear through my spine. I tried to scream, but the sound was choked in my chest, my voice too small to break free. The figure stepped out of the mirror, its form growing clearer with every movement. It wasn't entirely human, not in any way I had ever known. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its hands were gnarled and twisted, like broken tree branches. The face, if you could call it that, was contorted in a way that made my stomach churn. No mouth, no nose, just two wide, empty sockets where its eyes should have been. The skin was pale, sickly, stretched tight over its bones, and it was dripping with something that I couldn't identify. It was closer now, standing just behind me. I could feel its presence, so cold, so unnatural, that the hairs on my neck stood on end. My hands trembled at my sides, and I could hear my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the reflection, from the thing that was slowly, steadily closing the gap between us. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just words now. They were voices, angry and desperate, full of pain and anguish, all calling to me in a language I didn't understand. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, urging me to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed by fear. And then, in the reflection, the figure's empty sockets began to fill with dark, swirling mist, like smoke that curled out from within it. The swirling darkness began to take shape, forming words that burned themselves into my mind as if they were written in fire. You should never have stayed. The words echoed in my head, reverberating, filling every corner of the room. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the words caught in my throat. The figure in the mirror lifted one of its long, bony fingers and pointed directly at me. It was a gesture so deliberate, so haunting, that I could feel the weight of it in my chest, as though the thing was reaching inside me, clawing at my very soul. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward, away from the mirror, my mind racing, my thoughts a blur of confusion and terror. My heart thudded in my ears, and for a split second, I thought I was going to pass out. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, its presence suffocating. I turned to look at the door, desperate to escape, but as I reached for the handle, I realized with a sickening twist that it wasn't just stuck anymore. It was locked. The door was locked from the outside, and I was trapped. I slammed my shoulder into the door, pounding it with my fists, shouting for help, but my voice barely made it past my lips. It was as if the very air around me was thick with something that was pushing back against me, something that didn't want me to escape. And then I heard it. A soft, dragging sound behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. I could feel it. The presence was closing in on me, closer than ever before. The figure from the mirror had somehow crossed the threshold of reality and was standing just behind me, its icy fingers reaching out to touch me. I felt the coldness of its touch before I even saw it. It wasn't a touch like anything I'd ever felt. It was more like a freezing sensation, like ice seeping into my skin, sinking deep into my bones. I screamed, finally able to break free from the paralysis that had held me in place for so long. But the scream was muffled, as if the room itself were swallowing my voice. The thing behind me was almost upon me. I could feel its breath on my neck, a cold, damp wind that carried the stench of rot and decay. The whispers were now deafening, drowning out everything else, the sound of them like nails scraping against the inside of my skull. I spun around, expecting to see the figure standing there, towering over me. But there was nothing. Nothing but empty space. Yet the whispers didn't stop. They continued to grow louder, more urgent, as if the thing was taunting me, toying with me. I glanced around frantically, searching for a way out, but the room was closing in. The shadows were growing longer, twisting into grotesque shapes that didn't make sense, their forms bending and contorting like something out of a nightmare. I could hear the floor creaking beneath me, the walls groaning as if they were alive. And then it happened. The figure appeared in front of me again, its ghastly form materializing from the darkness. This time, it was right in front of me, standing too close for comfort, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. The air was thick with its presence, and I could feel my body trembling, my knees threatening to give way beneath me. The thing didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. I could feel its malice, its hatred, radiating off of it like heat from an inferno. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just here to scare me, it was here to claim me. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, the sound like the screech of metal dragging against stone. I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream, to claw my way out of this nightmare. But all I could do was stand there, helpless, as the figure's icy hand reached toward me. I closed my eyes, waiting for it to happen. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The air returned to normal, the coldness lifting. The whispers faded, and the room was silent once more. I opened my eyes, my heart racing, my breath shallow and ragged. The room was the same as it had been, but I knew better than to trust my own senses. The thing was still there, somewhere, lingering in the darkness. But I was no longer trapped in the room. I was trapped in its grip. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the middle of the room, after the figure had disappeared. My mind was reeling, processing everything that had just happened. The thick fog of fear that had settled over me was still there, but the silence was suffocating. It was as though everything had gone still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to react. But I couldn't move. I couldn't make sense of what had just occurred. The cold that had gripped my skin began to subside, but there was an unsettling warmth in its place, like something had invaded my body, leaving behind a residue of dread that I couldn't shake. My hands were shaking, my body trembling in exhaustion and terror. I staggered backward, trying to pull myself together, trying to focus on the task at hand. I needed to get out of the room. But how? The door was locked. I rushed to the door, my heart pounding, my fingers trembling as I tried the handle again. This time, when I twisted it, it gave way with a sharp, metallic click. The door swung open slowly, almost too easily, as though something was allowing me to leave. I glanced behind me, half expecting the figure to reappear, but the room was empty. With one last terrified glance at the room, I stepped out into the hallway. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and my legs felt weak beneath me, as though I might collapse at any moment. I couldn't understand what had just happened, what I had seen, or why it had all happened to me. I hurried down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the hotel. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the air felt thick, like something unseen was watching me, tracking my every move. I reached the elevator and pressed the button, my fingers trembling. It felt like an eternity before the doors finally opened, and I stepped inside, feeling like I was escaping into the unknown. But even as the doors closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly left. I glanced at my reflection in the polished elevator door, but there was no figure behind me. I stepped out into the lobby of the hotel, the bright lights and the low murmur of conversation offering a strange sense of normalcy. The staff at the front desk barely looked up as I approached, too absorbed in their own work to notice the pale, shaken man before them. I didn't know what to do. All I could think about was the figure, the mirror, the whispers. It was as though the events of the night had seeped into my soul, and no amount of distance could erase them. The hotel seemed so ordinary now, too ordinary for what I had experienced. But I knew better. I had seen something in that room, something that wasn't of this world, something I couldn't explain. I quickly checked out of the hotel, handing over my keys to the front desk clerk. They didn't ask any questions. No one seemed to care. It was as if they couldn't feel the lingering tension in the air, as if they hadn't seen the same thing I had. I stepped outside into the cool night air, but the dread didn't lift. I walked to my car, my steps quick, my heart still hammering in my chest. My mind raced with questions, but there were no answers. I was empty. Nothing made sense anymore. The drive back home was a blur. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept drifting back to the hotel room. To the figure, to the whispers, to the coldness that had wrapped itself around me like a shroud. I couldn't escape it. When I arrived at my apartment, I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. The quiet of the place felt suffocating. There was no mirror in the living room, no reflective surface to haunt me, but I could feel the weight of the experience pressing in on me from all sides. I sat down on the couch, my hands still trembling, my breath ragged as I tried to regain some sense of normalcy. But there was no normal anymore. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, heard the whispers, felt the chill of its presence. It was as if the thing had followed me home, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I could feel it in the corners of my mind, creeping in, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. The days passed in a fog. I went through the motions of daily life, but nothing felt the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figure was still out there, lingering just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was all a nightmare, that I had been imagining things, but I knew deep down that it was real. What I had experienced was real. I never went back to that hotel. I couldn't. The memories of that room, of the mirror, of the thing that had waited for me, were burned into my mind. I still don't know what it was or why it chose me. I don't know if I'll ever understand. Some nights, I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and I wonder if the thing is still out there, waiting for me to slip up. And sometimes, I feel the cold again, just for a moment. A chill that wraps itself around my spine, reminding me that I'm never truly safe. That it's always watching. I don't know if I'll ever find the answers. I don't know if anyone ever will. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the hotel room. As the months passed, life slowly began to settle into what could be called normal, but the memories of that night still lingered at the edge of my mind, as if they were just waiting to break through at any moment. Every time I looked in a mirror, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching me. No matter how much I tried to push the thoughts away, they always returned, quiet and insistent, like a shadow that refused to be cast off. I found myself thinking about that hotel room more than I cared to admit. The memories became so vivid, almost too vivid. I could still hear the whispering, the cold that had seeped into my bones, the way time had seemed to stretch and warp inside that room, as though the laws of reality had been bent in ways that I couldn't understand. It was as if that room had its own rules, its own boundaries, and once I crossed them, I had become part of something much larger, something beyond my control. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just encountered a ghost or a spirit. There had been something darker, something more malevolent in that room. What had it been? And why had it chosen me? I had no answers, no closure. What happened in that room didn't fit into any neat box, didn't match any of the logical explanations I'd tried to apply to it. It was a mystery, an enigma that remained unsolved. Despite this, I moved forward. Time has a way of dulling the edges of pain and fear, of turning even the most traumatic events into memories that fade just enough to make life livable again. I went back to my daily routines. I went to work, socialized with friends, and carried on. But I never truly left that hotel behind. It was a part of me now, a scar on my soul that I couldn't erase. At night, when I lay in bed, I would occasionally hear faint sounds, scratching, tapping, something that was just out of reach, like it was coming from the other side of the wall. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the creaking of the house settling or some other benign explanation. But deep down, I knew better. That feeling, the one that crept up my spine at odd hours of the night, was unmistakable. I wasn't safe. One evening, out of the blue, a package arrived at my door. It was a small, unmarked box with no return address, just my name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a single cracked mirror. The glass had jagged edges, but it was unmistakable. It was identical to the one in the hotel room. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. How had someone gotten this? And why was it here now? The box had no note, no explanation, just the mirror and the same suffocating silence. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, unable to look away, even as the fear in my chest grew. Then, as if on cue, the whispering began. It was faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. My heart raced as I looked around, expecting to see the figure from that night, the one that had haunted my every waking thought. But nothing, just the quiet hum of the city outside my window. Yet, in my mind, I could hear the whispers, clearer now, closer. And in the reflection of the shattered glass, I could almost make out a shape, a presence, one that was waiting for me to look away. I couldn't stop myself from staring into that cracked mirror, as if doing so would somehow hold the thing at bay, keep it from reaching out to me, from coming for me again. I stayed there for hours, my mind in turmoil, until exhaustion finally overtook me. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, the mirror was gone. There was no trace of it, no package, no evidence of anything ever having been there at all. But I knew that the darkness had found me again. It wasn't finished with me, and I don't think it ever will be. I moved away not long after that. I packed up my life and left everything behind: my job, my friends, my home, hoping that the further I went, the less I would feel the weight of that night pressing down on me. But there's no escaping what you've seen. There's no leaving behind the things that follow you, the things that lurk in the shadows of your mind. And that's the thing about fear. It doesn't need a reason to exist. It doesn't need an explanation. It just is. I don't know what's out there in the dark, waiting for me to slip up, but I know this for certain. I'll never go back to that hotel. I'll never look into another mirror the same way again. And every time I hear that whisper, whether in my dreams or in the back of my mind, I'll know the truth. It started like any other day. I was just an ordinary guy, living an ordinary life. My name's David, and I'm not the type to go looking for trouble. I don't chase after paranormal activity or play with things that go bump in the night. I'd say I'm a simple guy. Really work, home, repeat. My job isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills. I work as a graphic designer at a small firm downtown, which means most of my time is spent in front of a computer, crunching numbers and editing images. Nothing too exciting, just the usual grind. The house I live in? Well, it's nothing special either. It's an old 2-story place that I bought a few years ago. Nothing luxurious, but it has charm. The kind of charm that makes you feel at home after a long, tiring day. It's got squeaky floorboards, dusty corners, and that smell of age that settles into the walls. I've never thought much of it. It's just a house, right? But now, when I look back, I can't help but wonder if it was always meant to be more than just that. Something darker, perhaps. I share the house with my wife, Hannah, and our dog, Max. Hannah's a teacher, and she's the kind of person who makes everything look easy. She's got this calming presence about her, always with a smile, no matter how hard the day might have been. Max is our golden retriever, a goofy, happy dog with way too much energy for his own good. Honestly, it's pretty peaceful here. We've been living in this house for almost 3 years now, and I've never had any reason to think anything unusual was going on. But then, something happened. Something that would turn my whole world upside down. The day began like any other. I woke up to the sound of Max barking downstairs, a clear signal that he needed to go out. I dragged myself out of bed, already feeling the weight of the day ahead. Hannah was still asleep, as she always was when I got up. She's not much of a morning person. I let Max out in the backyard, and then it was time to make coffee. I had the morning routine down to a science: make the coffee, grab the newspaper, and sit down at the kitchen table for a few minutes of peace before the chaos of the day set in. As I sat there, sipping my coffee and flipping through the pages, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything concrete, just a sense of unease creeping up the back of my mind. I dismissed it, blaming it on the lack of sleep, and tried to shake it off. But as I walked down the hallway toward the stairs, I noticed something strange, something I hadn't seen before. At the end of the hall, near the guest bedroom, there was a door I'd never paid much attention to before. It was a small, nondescript door, almost like a closet. But as I looked at it now, I realized it wasn't a closet at all. In fact, it was a door that didn't belong. You see, I've always thought the layout of the house was pretty straightforward. No hidden rooms or passages. But this door was different. It was newer than the rest of the house, its paint a stark white compared to the faded walls around it. It had a brass handle that looked polished and untouched, like it had never been used. My mind raced for an explanation. Maybe it was just a closet that had been added at some point. Maybe the previous owner had done some renovations I didn't know about. But as I stared at the door, I realized something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had never noticed it before. I stood there for a moment, contemplating what to do. I could just ignore it, forget I ever saw it, and go about my day. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My curiosity got the better of me, and I reached for the handle. The door creaked as I turned it, the sound sending an uncomfortable shiver down my spine. It wasn't locked, which struck me as odd. If it was some kind of storage space or closet, shouldn't it have been locked or at least secured? I opened the door slowly, not sure what I was expecting to find. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw inside. The room was small, barely big enough for me to stretch out my arms, but it felt off. It was a plain, windowless room with nothing in it but a strange, old wooden chest in the center. The air inside was thick, heavy with dust, and the scent of something stale. It felt like it had been sealed off for years. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was something about the room that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't just the chest, it was everything. The silence in the room was suffocating, almost unnatural. I couldn't explain why, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like something was watching me. I stepped inside, my footfall muffled by the dust-covered floorboards. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to inspect the chest. It wasn't a large chest, but it was intricately carved, with strange symbols etched into the wood. Symbols I didn't recognize. I was sure I'd never seen them before, and yet, they felt familiar in a way that made my blood run cold. I reached for the lid, and as my fingers brushed against the surface, a cold shiver ran down my spine. But I couldn't stop now. The curiosity that had been building up inside me was overwhelming. I had to know what was inside. I lifted the lid, but what I found inside wasn't what I expected. It was only a small thing, but it stuck with me. After I opened that mysterious door and found the strange chest, I thought about it for the rest of the day. I didn't tell Hannah about it. I wasn't sure how to explain it to her without sounding crazy. Besides, it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. I figured I had just stumbled upon something I hadn't noticed before, some old storage space, maybe hidden away during a renovation. There had to be a rational explanation, right? But that night, something happened that changed everything. We had dinner like we always do, nothing fancy, just a quiet meal. Hannah and I were talking about our day, with Max at our feet, licking up any scraps that fell. I didn't bring up the door or the room. It felt too weird, too off. But as we sat there, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. It was like there was this subtle shift in the air, an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't explain. Hannah noticed it first. She had always been more perceptive than I gave her credit for. She'd pick up on the smallest things, like when I was in a bad mood before I even realized it. So, when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at me, I knew something was up. "David," she said, her voice low, "you're acting strange tonight." I looked at her, trying to mask my unease. "I'm just tired, I guess. Long day at work." But she wasn't convinced. "You sure? You've been distant all evening." I wasn't sure how to explain the way I was feeling. The best I could come up with was a vague, "I don't know. I just feel off, like something's not right." She studied me for a moment, her brow furrowed in concern, but then she shrugged. "It's probably just stress from work. You've been working a lot lately." I nodded, grateful that she didn't push further. The last thing I wanted was for her to start probing into my thoughts about the room and the chest. It all felt too bizarre, too unsettling to put into words. That night, as we got ready for bed, I tried to push everything out of my mind. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my thoughts racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door again, and the eerie chest sitting in the center of that tiny room. The symbols carved into the wood. The oppressive stillness in the air. I couldn't shake it. I finally fell asleep, but it was a restless sleep. And then, around 3 a.m., something happened that made everything feel even more wrong. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. It was faint but unmistakable footsteps coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was Max, maybe moving around in his sleep or looking for his favorite toy. But when I listened closer, I realized the sound was too heavy. I nudged Hannah awake. "Hannah," I whispered, my voice tight. "Do you hear that?" She groggily rubbed her eyes, clearly not fully awake. "What? Hear what?" "Footsteps," I said, my voice dropping lower. "Downstairs." She listened for a moment, and I could see the confusion cross her face. "There's nothing down there. she mumbled, already turning over to go back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her, and made my way downstairs. The house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that fills the air when something isn't quite right. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, everything seemed normal. Max was sleeping on his bed in the living room, snoring softly. The house was dark and silent. No sign of anyone or anything out of place. I stood there for a long moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The stress from work, the strange door, it was all starting to mess with my head. But then, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. At the far end of the hallway, near the guest bedroom, the door was open. I hadn't left it open. In fact, I was sure I had closed it earlier that morning after I'd checked the room. I walked over to the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There it was, that strange room I had found earlier, the one that felt off, the one I hadn't been able to forget. The door was ajar, as if someone had been in there. I couldn't explain it, but the sense of dread was almost unbearable. I had to check. I had to know. I reached for the door handle, but before I could touch it, I heard a sound behind me, faint but clear. A creak. Like the sound of floorboards groaning underfoot. I froze. My entire body went stiff. My heart was racing in my chest. I slowly turned around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. Nothing was there. The hallway was empty. But the creaking continued. It was coming from upstairs, from our bedroom. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to process everything at once. What was happening? Was this just my imagination? Was I sleep deprived, or was something real happening in this house? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, frozen in place, listening to the eerie sound of the creaking floorboards above. Then, without thinking, I turned and rushed up the stairs. I reached our bedroom door, which was slightly cracked open. I pushed it open cautiously, half expecting to see something I couldn't explain. But there was nothing there. Hannah was still asleep, completely oblivious to everything that had just happened. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. The footsteps, the creaks, the feeling of being watched. I had no answers, but one thing was certain. Something was wrong. Something was in this house, and it wasn't going to let me forget it. I slowly closed the door behind me and returned to bed, my mind unable to settle. The house felt different now, like it was holding something just beyond my reach, something I couldn't understand but knew was there. The room with the chest, the strange noises, it all felt connected, like a thread weaving through the fabric of my reality, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. As I lay there, wide awake, listening to the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in this house wasn't over yet. It was just getting started. The events started to grow more frequent, more intense, and much harder to ignore. After that night, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a product of stress and sleeplessness, but deep down, I knew something had changed in the house. Something had shifted, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Every little sound, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, everything seemed to trigger a heightened sense of awareness. The house didn't feel the same anymore. It was like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At first, the events were small, almost inconsequential. I'd hear strange noises in the walls, a faint scratching sound, or a door creaking open when I was sure it had been closed. Sometimes I'd catch fleeting glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but it was becoming harder to convince myself. It wasn't until the following week that things began to escalate in a way that I couldn't brush off. I woke up early one morning, well before the sun had come up. The house was still and quiet, but the moment I opened my eyes, I knew something was off. The air felt thick, heavier than usual. It was as if the house was holding some kind of tension just beneath the surface, waiting to break. I tried to shake off the feeling and got out of bed, careful not to wake Hannah. I didn't want to disturb her, especially after she had been working long hours, and I didn't want her to worry. But as I made my way downstairs, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every step I took felt deliberate, as though something or someone was following me. I entered the kitchen, the familiar scent of coffee grounds in the air, and I paused, looking around the room. Everything seemed normal, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The window was slightly ajar, and a draft was making the curtains sway gently. It was a strange thing to notice, but I couldn't recall opening it. I was about to go and close it when I heard something, a soft, muffled thud coming from the living room. I froze, listening intently. The house was still, too still. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural. The kind of silence that fills your ears and makes every small noise seem unnervingly loud. I walked cautiously toward the living room, every floorboard creaking beneath my feet. As I approached, I noticed Max standing in the doorway, his body tense, his fur bristling. His eyes were wide, locked onto something just beyond my reach. "Max?" I whispered, crouching down beside him. He didn't respond. He just kept staring, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the room. I stood there for a long moment, wondering what could be causing him to act so strange. The room was dimly lit by the weak early morning light coming through the window, but there was nothing there, no movement, no sign of anything out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that was slowly creeping up my spine. I walked toward the corner of the room slowly, and as I passed the coffee table, I saw it. A small, dark stain on the rug. It wasn't big, but it was unmistakable. It was fresh, too fresh. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately knelt down to inspect it. It looked like blood, but it was too small to be sure. I didn't want to think about what it could mean, but I had no choice. I touched it, feeling the coldness of it against my fingertips. It was still wet, and my stomach churned at the thought of where it might have come from. I glanced around the room again, but there was no other sign of anything unusual. Nothing that could explain the stain. I stood up and backed away, suddenly feeling the weight of the room pressing down on me. Max's eyes never left the corner of the room, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. It was as though something was just beyond my reach, waiting for me to notice it. I backed out of the room slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, and I returned to the kitchen. My mind was racing. I had to tell Hannah, but I wasn't sure what to say. How could I explain this? How could I tell her that our house was beginning to feel like it was alive, like something else was sharing the space with us? But when I went back upstairs and saw Hannah sleeping peacefully, I decided against waking her. There was no point in scaring her before I knew what was really going on. Instead, I grabbed my phone and tried to search for any answers. Was this happening to anyone else? Was I just going crazy? But there was nothing. No reports of strange occurrences in the area. No similar stories from anyone I knew. It was just me. Just the house. I didn't know how much longer I could ignore it. Over the next few days, the incidents grew more frequent. The odd noises, the creaks, the strange drafts, they all continued, but now they were becoming harder to dismiss. It wasn't just the house that felt off. It was me, too. I was constantly on edge, unable to relax. I'd find myself checking the locks on the doors multiple times, even though I knew they were secure. I'd glance over my shoulder for no reason, as though someone was right behind me. Then, one night, It happened again. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of unease, when I heard a knock at the front door. It was a soft knock, almost too soft to hear over the hum of the house, but it was there, distinct and clear. I stood up, surprised. We weren't expecting anyone, and the neighborhood was quiet at this time of night. I checked the time just after midnight. Who could be knocking at our door now? I cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine. I opened the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped outside, scanning the darkened front yard. The street was empty, save for the distant glow of streetlights. There was no sign of anyone. But when I turned back toward the house, something caught my eye. The door to the room with the chest, the room I had found weeks ago, was slightly open. I hadn't opened it. I was certain of that. And yet, there it was standing wide open, as though someone had been inside. I felt a wave of panic rush over me, my breath catching in my throat. I knew what I had to do. I had to go in. I had to see what was happening, what was inside that room. But something told me that I wasn't going to like what I found. I slowly made my way down the hallway, my legs feeling heavy, as though they were fighting me every step of the way. The closer I got to the room, the more the air seemed to thicken, until it felt like I was walking through molasses. I reached the door, and my hand hovered over the handle. I could feel my pulse racing, my fingers trembling as I pushed the door open. The room was dark, almost suffocating in its silence. And then I saw it. The chest. But it was different now. It wasn't just a wooden box anymore. It was alive. The symbols that had been carved into the chest's surface were glowing faintly, casting an eerie light that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. And as I stood there, frozen in place, I realized one terrifying thing. Whatever was in this house wasn't going to let me leave. The room grew colder as I stepped deeper into the shadows, and my breath became visible in the air, forming small clouds that dissipated quickly. The faint light from the chest pulsed faster now, almost like it was reacting to my presence. I could hear my heart thundering in my chest, drowning out the silence around me. Each step I took toward the chest felt heavier, as though the room itself was resisting me, trying to hold me back. I couldn't move my legs. They felt like stone, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave the house, to forget everything that had been happening. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, drawing me closer to the chest. I reached out with trembling hands, feeling the pull of the strange energy in the room. And then I touched it. The moment my fingers made contact with the surface of the chest, everything around me went completely still. It was as if the air itself had frozen, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The pulsing light from the chest intensified, and suddenly, I was no longer alone in the room. I gasped as I felt something cold and sharp brush against the back of my neck. A whisper of air, colder than any wind I had ever felt, seemed to encircle me, tightening with each passing second. And then came the voice. It wasn't spoken aloud, but I could hear it in my head, a low, guttural whisper that made my skin crawl. Leave. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command, one I felt deep in my bones. The voice was so chilling, so dark, that it paralyzed me where I stood. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The weight of the air in the room was unbearable, pressing against me, suffocating me. And then I saw it. From the shadows in the far corner of the room, something began to take shape. Slowly, painfully, like it was trying to push its way out of the darkness itself, a figure emerged. It was tall, far taller than any human should be, and its limbs were long and unnaturally thin. Its skin was gray and cracked, as though it had been dead for a long time. Its eyes were black, hollow voids, empty and endless. It moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, like a puppet with broken strings, and I could feel the air grow colder as it drew closer. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. I was frozen in place, trapped in the nightmare unfolding before me. The figure stopped just in front of me, its black eyes fixed on mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. This wasn't something I could understand. This was beyond my comprehension. It was beyond anything I had ever known. And then it spoke. Release me. The words were not a whisper now, but a deep, resonant voice that seemed to echo through my mind, vibrating my skull. I felt as though the walls of the room were closing in around me, as if the house itself was alive and trying to swallow me whole. The figure reached out, its long skeletal hand grasping at the air between us. It didn't touch me, but the sensation was worse than any physical contact could have been. I could feel its presence, suffocating me, invading my very thoughts. Release me. The words repeated over and over again, growing louder, more insistent, until I felt like I was going to lose my mind. I couldn't understand what it wanted or why it was here, but I knew one thing. I wasn't supposed to be in this room. I wasn't supposed to have opened the chest. The figure was the key to everything, the source of the strange occurrences, the darkness that had been creeping into our lives. And now it wanted something from me. I tried to pull away, but my body refused to respond. I couldn't breathe. The cold was overwhelming, numbing me to the core. The figure's eyes bored into me, and I could feel its gaze crawling under my skin, dragging me deeper into its web. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared back into the shadows. The room went quiet again, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly, but the sense of dread lingered, like an aftertaste that wouldn't go away. I staggered back, gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. My hands were trembling, slick with cold sweat. My legs finally gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What had I seen? What had just been in front of me? Was it a hallucination, a trick of my mind? I tried to rationalize it, but the terror was too real, too raw. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't ignore it. In the midst of my panic, I remembered Hannah. She was still upstairs, still unaware of what was happening. I couldn't let her come near this place. She was safer away from it. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever I had just witnessed, wasn't just going to stay in this room. It wasn't just going to stay within these walls. It was going to spread. It was going to reach her. I had to get out of the house. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door, the one that had been locked, was now open, wide open, and standing in the doorway was Hannah. Her eyes were wide, glassy, like she was in a trance. Her body was stiff, unmoving, and there was no expression on her face. She looked like she was sleepwalking, but I knew better. There was something wrong with her. Something was controlling her, and it wasn't her. "Stay with me," she said, her voice low and hollow, not her own. My heart stopped. I tried to call out to her, to snap her out of whatever trance she was in, but her eyes never left me. She took a slow step forward, her body jerking slightly with each movement, as if she wasn't in full control of it. "Stay with me." I knew then that whatever had been unleashed in that room had gotten to her. The darkness wasn't just contained in the chest anymore. It was inside her now, too. I couldn't let her become part of it. I couldn't let her stay like that. But when I tried to move toward her, to pull her away, my body froze. It was as if the room itself was preventing me from going any further. I could feel it again, the heavy weight of the air, pressing down on me, pushing me back. I wasn't going to get out. None of us were going to get out. The house had already claimed us. And then, just as I was about to give in to the overwhelming sense of dread, I saw the chest. The symbols on it were glowing again, but this time the light was blinding. The shadows in the room began to twist and writhe, pulling together as if they were taking on a life of their own. And in that moment, I understood. The figure I had seen wasn't just something that had been trapped. It was something that had been waiting for someone to open the chest, waiting for someone to set it free. And now, that someone was me. I had made a terrible mistake. And now, there was no going back. The air felt heavier now, the silence of the house suffocating. I could barely breathe as I looked at Hannah, her eyes still hollow and unblinking, her body stiff and unyielding. I could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent in the room, like it was watching us, waiting for its next move. The chest's eerie glow filled the room, casting long shadows across the floor. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. What was this thing? What had I unleashed? And most importantly, what did it want from us? "Hannah," I whispered, my voice hoarse, barely a sound in the overwhelming quiet. I reached out toward her, but the weight of the room pressed down on me like a hand on my chest, holding me back. She didn't respond. She just stood there, her expression blank, as if she wasn't even aware of my presence. My heart pounded in my chest, a feeling of helplessness creeping in as I realized there was nothing I could do. I was trapped in this nightmare. But then I remembered the stories I'd heard as a child, the warnings, the superstitions, the things people whispered about cursed objects and haunted places. I had ignored all of them, thinking they were just old wives' tales. But now I knew better. I had to do something, anything, to break the hold this thing had on her. "Please," I begged, more to myself than to her. "Come back to me." But it was no use. She didn't move, didn't even blink. I felt a pang of despair wash over me. If this thing had its grip on her so tightly, then what chance did I have of getting her back? The chest's glow flickered, and I thought I saw something shift within its depths, something dark, something alive. Then it spoke again, the same low, guttural voice that had echoed in my mind before. "Release me." The room seemed to pulse with the words, the walls themselves vibrating, as if the house was alive, feeding off the energy of the chest. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, as though the house was preparing to claim me too. I had no time left. I had to act. I turned back to Hannah, my thoughts clouded by panic. I had to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. She wasn't herself, not entirely. Something else had taken control of her. I stepped closer to her, reaching out for her hand, and for a moment, she seemed to react. Her fingers twitched, just slightly, but it was enough to give me hope. I gripped her hand tightly, holding onto her like my life depended on it, because, in that moment, I knew it did. "Hannah," I said, my voice stronger now, "you have to wake up. You have to fight it. Please." But the longer I stood there, the less I felt in control. It was as though the house itself was resisting me, pushing against my will. The chest's glow intensified, blinding me, and I heard the voice again, louder this time, filling the space, vibrating in my chest. "Leave. Now." The command was clear. It wasn't asking anymore. It was demanding. I pulled Hannah toward the door, desperate to get her out of the room. But her body didn't move with mine. She resisted, her arms stiff as a board, as if some unseen force was holding her in place. I could feel her pulse beneath my fingertips, but it was faint, too faint. And then, as if the house were letting me see just how hopeless the situation had become, the shadows in the room began to shift again. They moved, twisting around the room like living creatures, crawling across the walls and floor, seeking something, reaching for us. My stomach turned, a wave of nausea overtaking me as I realized that whatever had been inside the chest was not done with us. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. The figure I had seen earlier, the one that had spoken to me in that horrifying voice, wasn't gone. It was still here, still haunting us. And it wasn't alone. Whatever had been released from the chest was free now, and it wanted more. I couldn't let it have us. I couldn't let it take Hannah. But how could I stop something so powerful, so ancient? What could I possibly do to fight back? I had one choice left, the chest. Whatever was inside it, whatever dark force had been unleashed, had to be contained again. If I could somehow seal it back inside the chest, maybe, just maybe, we could escape. Maybe the house would release us, and we could finally get out of here alive. I turned back to the chest, feeling the weight of its presence as it pulsed with energy. I had no idea what would happen if I opened it again, but I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't, we wouldn't make it out of this house. The darkness would consume us both. "Please," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Let this be the end." I took a step toward the chest, my body trembling with fear, my mind clouded with doubt. I reached out to touch the chest again, hoping that whatever force had been holding me back would release its grip. I couldn't let fear stop me now, not when Hannah was still standing there, helpless. The moment my hand made contact with the chest, everything shifted. A deep, resonant sound filled the room, a low hum that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. The walls seemed to shudder, and the air thickened, almost unbearable, pressing against me from all sides. And then the chest opened. I gasped as I saw the shadowy figure inside, its black eyes staring up at me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. It was waiting for me to make a choice. But what could I do? Then, out of nowhere, I felt a sharp pull. Something grabbed my arm, yanking me away from the chest. It was Hannah. Her grip was stronger now, more urgent, and I looked at her in disbelief. Her eyes were no longer empty, they were full of life, full of fear. "We have to go," she said, her voice shaky, but unmistakably hers. I couldn't argue. I didn't even think. I just followed her, running toward the door, pulling her behind me. The house seemed to scream in protest, the air thick with the weight of the dark force we had released. But we couldn't stop. We couldn't stay. We made it to the front door, and I slammed it open, spilling out into the night. The fresh air hit my face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. The tension, the weight of the house, seemed to lift as we stepped into the yard. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew better. The house, the chest, the darkness, whatever it was still there. But it was no longer our problem. We ran. We ran as far as we could, not looking back, not even speaking until we were miles away. Only then did we stop to catch our breath, our bodies shaking, our minds still reeling from the terror we had experienced. We never returned to that house. We never spoke of it again. And to this day, I don't know what truly happened in that room. I don't know what was inside that chest. But I do know this. Some things are better left undisturbed. Some doors are better left unopened. As for the house, it still stands, abandoned and decaying, just like the dark force inside it. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear the faintest whisper, like a distant memory, calling me back. Release me. But I know better now. I'm done with it. It's funny how time can twist memories. Sometimes, the things you think you'll never forget start to fade. The more I try to remember that night, everything that happened, the terrifying weight of the house, the strange, impossible darkness that clung to us, the more it starts to feel like a distant dream, something I experienced but can barely recall. But then I'll have moments, little flashes, where everything comes rushing back, and it's as if I'm standing right there again, caught in the grip of that nightmare. I don't talk about it anymore, not to anyone. I think part of me is scared that if I do, I'll open the door to something that can never be closed again. Hannah and I haven't spoken about the house since we left. We've never even brought it up, not once, and I don't think either of us ever will. It's one of those things you can't share because no one would believe you. Even now, it feels like the kind of story you tell around a campfire, one that sounds far too ridiculous to be true. And yet, when you're alone in the dark, it still makes your skin crawl. But every so often, a strange, heavy silence will settle over me. When I'm sitting alone in my apartment or walking down a quiet street at night, I feel it, the whisper of something I can't explain. It's as though I'm being watched, though I can't pinpoint where it's coming from. I know it sounds paranoid, but it's the kind of paranoia that lingers, creeping up your spine when the lights flicker or the wind howls just a little too loudly. Sometimes it feels like the house, the dark, ancient force that I tried so desperately to escape, followed us, seeping into the corners of my life, just waiting for the right moment to show itself again. I can't deny it. I'm haunted, not by the house, not by the chest, but by the knowledge that I've crossed a line. We all know there are things in this world, in this life, that we aren't meant to understand. There are forces out there, old things that existed long before any of us were born. Things we're better off leaving undisturbed. But I couldn't do that. I had to know what was in that room, in that chest. And now, the consequences are still with me, lingering like the faintest trace of smoke that never quite fades. I remember, vividly, the last thing I heard before I ran out of that house, before the door slammed shut and I left it all behind. It wasn't a scream, or a shout, or a crash. It was a voice. Deep, powerful, filled with the kind of weight that could crush a person's soul. Release me. That voice still echoes in my head sometimes, even after all these years. I hear it when I'm alone, when the house is too quiet, when the weight of the world seems just a little too heavy to bear. It's as if that thing, whatever it was, is waiting, still trying to find a way back. I don't know what it wanted or what it would have done if we hadn't left when we did. Part of me wonders if we made a mistake, if running away like we did only prolonged the inevitable. Maybe the house is still waiting, still calling to us. But then again, maybe it's over. Maybe whatever was unleashed is gone, lost to the void of forgotten things. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not finished with me, or Hannah, or anyone who's been in that house. When I think about the chest, about the room that never should have existed, I feel a deep sense of regret. Not because I didn't leave it alone, but because I'll never really know what could have happened if I had. The house might still stand, decaying and forgotten, but it's not the house that haunts me. It's the knowledge that there are doors out there, doors to places we're never meant to go, things we're never meant to see. We may think we're in control, that we have the answers, that we can handle whatever comes our way. But sometimes we open a door and let something in that we can never put back. I've tried to move on. I've tried to forget. I've filled my life with work, with friends, with distractions, but every now and then I'll be sitting alone in the dark and I'll hear that voice again, faint, like a whisper on the wind. Release me. It's not just the voice of the house. It's not just the chest. It's something deeper, something ancient. Maybe it's the reminder that there are some things that we, as human beings, aren't supposed to understand. But once we open that door, once we disturb the ancient forces of the world, we can't ever truly close it again. So I live with that fear now, and I know that I always will. Because the more I try to forget, the more it creeps into my life, like a shadow in the corner of my eye. It's always there, waiting. Maybe someday it'll find its way back to me. Maybe, someday, I'll have to face it again. But for now, I wait, knowing that the true horror isn't the house, the chest, or the things that lurk in the darkness. The true horror is the fear that comes when we open the wrong door, and we're left wondering if we'll ever be free of it. This is the story of a journey that took a turn none of us could have predicted. A tale of one man's unsettling encounter with a place that defied all logic, a town so forgotten that not a trace of it could be found on any map. It started with a simple road trip, the kind I'd taken hundreds of times before. It was late autumn, and the days were growing shorter. The sun was already dipping behind the hills as I cruised down an old, winding highway. The car hummed quietly, and I had the windows cracked just enough to let the crisp evening air drift inside. I'd been on this route for hours, following the usual signs that led me further into the remote stretches of the countryside. I was a man used to solitude. As a writer, I spent a lot of time on the road, seeking inspiration from the far corners of the country. The drive was my time to think, to reflect. I didn't need much, just the road and my thoughts. This particular trip, I was heading to a small town for a short getaway. Nothing too extravagant, just a place to clear my head and recharge. A tiny spot on the map with a few scattered houses and not much else. The sort of place where nothing ever really happens, but it's perfect for someone who craved peace. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. I had no real schedule, just a vague idea of where I wanted to go. I trusted the GPS, which had been guiding me without incident until it suddenly flickered and went dark. I glanced at the screen, confused. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping it was just a glitch, but even after restarting the device, the screen remained blank. The silence of the rural landscape outside felt almost suffocating as I sat in my car, wondering if I should turn back. But I had already been driving for hours, and I knew that if I went back now, I'd lose the opportunity to reach the peaceful retreat I'd been dreaming of. The faint glow of my car's headlights illuminated the small road ahead, a winding stretch that seemed to lead into nowhere. The world was dark and quiet, and for a moment, I felt oddly disconnected from everything. It wasn't just the absence of the GPS, it was something else, something harder to place. The air felt still, and the road seemed eerily empty, devoid of any other cars or signs of life. But I was stubborn. I decided to keep going. After all, I was just a short distance from my destination, or so I thought. As I rounded a sharp bend in the road, I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was just another farmhouse, a distant light in the darkness. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't a farmhouse at all. It was a small town, nestled in a valley, bathed in an amber glow from the lights that dotted its streets. The buildings were old, but they had a charm about them, standing in quiet rows, as though they'd been untouched by time. I was surprised. There had been no sign of a town on the map, no indication that I was about to drive into anything resembling a settlement. But there it was, right in front of me. I slowed down, the curiosity about this unknown place beginning to gnaw at me. Was it on my route? How had I missed it? I glanced at the road signs again, but they offered no answers, just the same blank spaces that had been on the signs for miles. It was almost as if the town had materialized out of nowhere. I rolled the windows down to get a better sense of the place, but the air didn't feel fresh as I'd expected. Instead, it carried a faint odor, a mix of damp earth and something old. A strange discomfort crept over me, but I pushed it aside. I was here now, and I needed to find somewhere to stop and rest for the night. I decided to drive through the town, just to see what it was all about. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so. There was no one walking about, no cars parked along the side of the road, just empty storefronts and the occasional light flickering from a window. The buildings looked like they hadn't been touched in decades, weathered, peeling paint, and signs that seemed to have faded with age. but there was something oddly comforting about it too. Something that invited me to stay longer. I drove past a few houses, each one more isolated than the last. The farther I went, the more I felt the weight of this place pressing down on me. It was as if the air itself was thick, and each building seemed to be watching me as I passed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just some forgotten corner of the world, a place untouched by time. Eventually, I found a small inn at the end of the street. It was a modest place, but it had the kind of charm that only a small, out-of-the-way hotel could offer. I parked my car and walked up to the door. There was a small bell above it that jingled as I pushed it open. The sound of the bell echoed through the empty space inside, and for a moment I wondered if anyone was there. But then, from the back room, a man emerged. He was tall, with a rough-looking face and a quiet demeanor. He greeted me without much enthusiasm, almost as though he had been expecting me. "I can offer you a room," he said, his voice low, barely audible over the quiet of the inn. "It's not much, but it's all we have." I nodded and followed him upstairs to a room at the end of the hallway. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and I couldn't help but feel a strange unease settle into my bones. The air was still, and the room smelled of old wood and dust. But there was a bed, and it looked comfortable enough. I decided to settle in for the night, hoping that tomorrow would bring some answers about this strange town. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence outside, the strange man at the inn, the empty streets, nothing felt quite as it should. But I was too tired to think about it any longer and eventually drifted off to sleep, unaware that the events of the next few days would change everything I thought I knew about this place. I woke up the next morning to a strange sense of disorientation. The sun had barely risen, casting a dim light into the room, but it wasn't the light that woke me, it was the sound. At first, I thought it was a train, distant but vibrating through the earth, but the more I listened, the less certain I became. The noise was low and persistent, like a dull hum coming from somewhere deep beneath the ground. It was odd. The town seemed too quiet for there to be any heavy machinery or industrial activity. I tried to shake it off as just the usual early morning disorientation, but as I sat up in bed, I felt something heavy in the air, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore either. I dressed quickly, trying to clear my head. The inn was eerily still, not a single sound coming from the hallway. I stepped into the narrow corridor, which had a lingering smell of aged wood and dust, and made my way down the stairs to the lobby. The man who had checked me in the night before wasn't there. The place seemed even emptier now, if that was possible. I stepped outside, hoping to clear my mind with some fresh air. The town was quiet, even more so than I had remembered the night before. The streets were still, no one was around, and not a single car was parked along the roads. I felt a strange pull to walk deeper into the town, so I did, hoping to find something that would make sense of this strange place. As I walked down the main street, I passed several houses with windows shut tight. Not a single person in sight. No animals, no children playing, no sounds of life. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath. I walked for several minutes until I reached a small park at the end of the street. There, standing alone in the center of the park, was an old fountain. It looked out of place, as if it had been left behind by time itself. The water was stagnant, the stone base cracked and covered in moss. What struck me the most, though, was the unsettling silence that surrounded it. The hum I had heard earlier was louder here, vibrating in the back of my mind, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere beneath the earth. I moved closer to the fountain, hoping to find some explanation for the noise. The moment I approached, the hum shifted. It became erratic, almost as if it were reacting to my presence. My heartbeat quickened, and I stepped back, feeling a growing sense of unease. That's when I noticed a shadow moving across the ground, shifting like it was alive. At first, I thought it was just the play of light and shadows from the trees, but then I realized there was no breeze, no movement in the air to explain it. The shadow didn't make sense. It wasn't cast by any object or structure around me. It was as if it had a mind of its own, moving independently from the world around it. I took a step back, my body tense, and the shadow moved in sync with me. I froze, staring at the ground beneath my feet. The sensation was suffocating. I felt like I was being watched, and I wasn't sure if I was the one being followed or if the shadow was moving toward me. I turned and walked briskly away from the park, my footsteps quick and erratic. The hum followed me, faint but persistent. It felt like the town itself was vibrating, like some hidden force was at work, pushing and pulling at the fabric of reality. The sound didn't belong, and neither did the shadow. Everything about this place seemed wrong. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply off. The strange hum in the air, the inexplicable shadow, it all felt like a warning, an omen of something far darker than I could understand. I returned to the inn, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. I found the innkeeper sitting behind the front desk, reading a newspaper. His face was impassive, as though nothing had happened in the town at all. I couldn't help but wonder if he had any clue about the strange things that were going on. I cleared my throat and asked him if the town was always this quiet. "The town?" he said, his voice flat, with no hint of emotion. "It's always like this. Peaceful. It's not a place for outsiders to hang around." His words sent a chill down my spine. There was something in his tone, something too casual, too practiced. It didn't sit right with me. I had the distinct impression that he wasn't telling me the whole truth. I decided not to press him further. Instead, I asked if there was anywhere I could get something to eat, hoping that maybe food would clear my head. The innkeeper gave me a dull, almost imperceptible nod and directed me to a small diner down the street. When I arrived, the diner was as quiet as the rest of the town. The faint clinking of silverware against plates was the only sound breaking the silence. The cook behind the counter nodded at me as I took a seat at one of the empty tables. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just continued to stir whatever was simmering in a pot, his back turned to me. I ordered a coffee, though I wasn't particularly hungry. My mind kept wandering back to the strange events of the morning, the hum, the shadow. I had no explanation for any of it, but deep down, I felt like something was watching me, waiting. After a few minutes, the waitress brought over my coffee. She didn't speak either, just set the cup in front of me with a soft clink. Her face was pale, and her eyes had a strange emptiness to them. I tried to make small talk, asking her how long the town had been here, whether there were any attractions worth visiting, but she didn't respond. She only nodded slowly, as though my words didn't matter. There was an uncomfortable stillness in the air between us, and it felt as though she was no more alive than the town itself, frozen in time, stuck in a place where nothing moved forward. I left the diner soon after, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I didn't want to stay in the town any longer. Something about it was suffocating. I was a stranger here, but I didn't feel welcome. In fact, I felt like I was being deliberately kept out of the loop, like I wasn't supposed to know what was really going on. As I walked back to the inn, I passed by the park again. The hum was louder now, almost deafening. I hurried my pace, eager to get back to the safety of the inn. But just as I was passing the fountain, I saw something out of the corner of my eye movement in one of the windows of the nearby houses. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. A face. Just for a moment, I saw it pale, staring directly at me from behind the glass. The eyes were wide, unnaturally so, and they seemed to be watching me with a deep, unsettling intensity. I blinked, and the face was gone. I quickly turned away, my pulse racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted by something I couldn't see. This town, this strange, forgotten place, there was something wrong with it, something that went beyond anything I could explain. And the more I tried to make sense of it, the less real it all seemed. The unsettling events of the morning were just the beginning. Something was happening here, something I wasn't prepared for, and I had a feeling it wouldn't be long before the truth started to reveal itself in ways I couldn't ignore. The next few days in the town blurred together. The strange hum, which had once been just an occasional whisper in the background, had grown stronger, more insistent. It was no longer confined to the early morning hours. Now it lingered, persistent and low, throughout the entire day. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But each time I tried to ignore it, the hum would grow louder, as if it were purposefully drawing my attention. I couldn't escape it. Everywhere I went, the air seemed thick with this unseen force, this energy that vibrated through the ground, the walls, the air itself. I could feel it in my chest, a deep, pulsing pressure that rattled my bones. At night, it was worse. The hum grew louder, more distorted, until it became a throbbing ache in my head, making it impossible to sleep. But it wasn't just the sound. There were other things I couldn't explain. One evening, I walked through the town, trying to clear my head. I passed the same streets, the same empty houses, the same uninhabited buildings. The silence weighed on me like a thick blanket, stifling and suffocating. I could feel my skin prickling with the knees, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I walked. The town had no life, at least, no life that I could see. But as I rounded a corner near the town square, something caught my eye. A figure standing just inside the doorway of an old, dilapidated building. I froze. It wasn't a person, not really. It was more of a shadow, a dark, flickering shape that seemed to dance in and out of view, just beyond the edges of the light. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. I could barely make out its form through the dim light, but the shape seemed wrong. It moved in a jerky, disjointed way, as though it was struggling to maintain its form. I hesitated, watching the figure for what felt like an eternity. The hum grew louder in my ears, as though it was coming directly from this figure, this shadow, this thing I couldn't explain. I took a step forward, my legs trembling, but the moment I moved, the figure disappeared, vanished into thin air. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. What the hell was that? My eyes darted around, trying to find any sign of movement, any sign that it had just been a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But there was nothing, no movement, no sounds, just the hum, still pulsing in the air. I turned quickly, my mind racing. This town was becoming more and more like a nightmare. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The figure, whatever it was, didn't make sense. And the hum, this constant vibration in the air, seemed to be feeding into it, warping everything around me. I went back to the inn, my mind racing. As I entered, the innkeeper barely glanced up from his book. The air inside was thick with that same oppressive silence, but there was something different about the atmosphere tonight. It felt heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I went up to my room, hoping to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. The hum was louder than ever, echoing in my ears as I lay there in the dark. The silence of the town was unbearable now, as if the world had simply stopped, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I decided I had to get out. I needed answers. I couldn't stand the feeling of being trapped in this place, suffocated by the hum, by the ever-present sense that something was wrong. So I set out, determined to find out what was happening. I wandered the streets, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting across a window, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. It was like the town itself was playing tricks on me, like it was alive in some strange, sinister way, pulling me deeper into its web. I stopped at the park again, near the fountain. The hum was almost deafening here, like it was coming from beneath the ground, from deep within the earth itself. I knelt by the fountain, my hands trembling as I ran my fingers along the cracked stone. There was something odd about the fountain, something that didn't feel right. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the stone itself was breathing, alive in some way. I stood up and scanned the area, my heart pounding. The shadow I had seen before, the one near the abandoned building, was there again, flickering in and out of sight just beyond the trees. This time, I didn't hesitate. I had to know what it was. I had to face it, whatever it was. I stepped forward cautiously, my eyes locked on the shadow as it shifted, moving in a jerky, unnatural motion. It was like it didn't belong in this world, like it was something out of place, something from a different reality altogether. As I approached, the hum grew louder, more intense. It reverberated through the air, rattling my teeth and making my head spin. I reached out a hand, feeling the air around me crackling with energy. The shadow stopped moving for a moment, as though it had sensed my approach. And then it vanished just like before. It was gone, as if it had never been there. I stood there in the silence, my mind racing. What the hell was going on in this town? The hum, the shadows, the strange figures that appeared and disappeared at will, nothing made sense. I had to get to the bottom of this. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something new. A figure standing at the edge of the park, watching me. This one was different. It wasn't a shadow or a flicker of movement. It was a person, standing completely still, just outside the trees. But they weren't moving. They were staring at me, their face obscured by a hood or something that covered their head. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I couldn't make out their features, but I could feel their eyes on me. I felt exposed, like I was the one being hunted now, the prey in some twisted game. I took a step back, and the figure took a step forward. I didn't know how to explain it, but I knew I had to get away from them. There was something so wrong about the way they stood there, so eerily still, so deliberate. I turned and ran, not looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. As I raced back to the inn, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The hum seemed to grow louder with every step, and the air felt thick with an oppressive weight. It was like the town itself was pushing me away, urging me to leave. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to know what was happening. And the more I tried to escape, the more I realized that this town, this forgotten place, had its claws in me. It wasn't going to let me go. And if I didn't find out the truth soon, I feared I might never leave. The tension had been building for days, each strange occurrence layering atop the last, each unsettling whisper tightening its grip around me. I could no longer ignore the feeling that the town was alive, that it was watching me, waiting for something. The hum had grown so intense that it felt as if it were vibrating through my very soul, rattling my thoughts. I couldn't breathe without it, couldn't think without it. It had become a part of me, suffocating me in a way I couldn't explain. I couldn't leave. I had thought of it many times, packing up, running as far as I could, but something always held me back. Some part of me believed that I was meant to uncover the truth. Maybe it was sheer curiosity, or maybe it was fear. Fear that if I left, I would never truly understand what had happened here. What was happening to me? But as I stood in the center of the town that night, staring up at the full moon hanging in the black sky, I knew I could no longer ignore it. The time had come to face whatever was lurking beneath the surface. I had been drawn back to the park, to the fountain, the very place where the hum had first felt the most intense. It was almost as though it were calling to me, urging me to return. I approached the fountain cautiously, my every step careful, like the ground beneath me might give way at any moment. The air was thick, the silence heavy, but the hum was deafening now. I could feel it in my chest, the way it vibrated through my bones, my muscles. It had become a presence, a force in the air, and it was so loud now that I could no longer ignore it. It was almost as if it were coming from the very fountain itself. The stone was warm to the touch, unnaturally so, like it had been heated from within. I ran my hand along the edge of the fountain, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I froze. There was a crack. A sharp, echoing sound that sliced through the oppressive silence like a knife. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled my hand back. The crack in the stone seemed to grow wider before my eyes, and from within it, something started to emerge. At first, it was just a sliver, a thin tendril of blackness stretching out from the crack. But then it grew wider, longer, until it was more like a shape, something rising from the depths of the fountain. A shape that was not human, but something else entirely. It moved, sluggish at first, like it was waking from a long slumber, then more fluidly, as if it were stretching its limbs. And then I saw it. The thing that emerged from the fountain was like nothing I had ever seen before. It was a mass of shadows and fluid motion, an ever-shifting shape that seemed to defy any sense of logic. Its surface rippled, as though it were made of darkness itself, and its tendrils reached out, slowly, deliberately, like the fingers of some monstrous hand, searching for something or someone. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath shallow and panicked. The hum reached a crescendo, vibrating through the air with such intensity that I felt as though I might be torn apart by it. The world around me seemed to warp, bending and twisting as the figure before me grew larger, its form becoming more defined with each passing moment. The air was thick with an oppressive, choking energy that made it impossible to breathe, impossible to think. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I could feel the town itself, the very earth, moving, shifting, as if it were alive, reacting to the thing that had been unleashed. And then it spoke. A voice, if it could even be called, that rippled through the air. It wasn't words, not in the traditional sense. It was more of a sound, a vibration that resonated deep in my chest, like a thunderclap that echoed through my bones. It was a sensation, not a language, and yet it communicated with a clarity that made my blood run cold. You should have left. The words or the sensation of them punched into my mind, filling every corner of my consciousness. I couldn't move, couldn't even think properly. My body was frozen, my limbs stiff as stone, my mind a whirl of confusion and terror. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. It's too late now. The voice echoed again, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through me like the force of an earthquake. My head spun, and I could feel my thoughts unraveling, snapping apart, being torn away from me. My vision blurred, the edges of the world distorting, melting into the same blackness that had emerged from the fountain. And then, out of the darkness, something reached for me. I didn't see it at first, just felt it. A cold, slimy tendril wrapping around my arm, pulling me toward the thing that had emerged from the fountain. I tried to scream, but no words came. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. I struggled, fighting against the pull, but it was like trying to swim against a riptide. The force was too strong, too overwhelming. You are not meant to leave. The words, if they could even be called, that rippled through the air again, this time accompanied by a low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once. The ground beneath me shifted, buckling, as if the earth itself were tearing open. I looked around, desperate for some escape, but there was nowhere to run. The town, the entire place, had become part of this nightmare. The hum was all around me, vibrating through the earth, the air, my body. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, a force that seemed to permeate everything. It was suffocating, consuming. The figure before me, this thing that had emerged from the depths of the fountain, continued to grow, expanding, its form shifting and changing. It was no longer just a mass of shadows. It had taken shape, taken form, something monstrous and horrific, an abomination that no human mind could comprehend. Its face, if it could be called that, was a mass of shifting, writhing shapes. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, two glowing orbs of bright, blinding light that seemed to burn into my soul. I felt my mind slipping, my thoughts unraveling in the face of this unimaginable horror. And then, as if in some twisted final act, the thing lunged forward, its tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me into the darkness, pulling me down into the depths of the town where I was never meant to go. And then nothing. The darkness swallowed me whole, pulling me into its depths like a predator snaring its prey. My vision blurred as the sensation of falling overtook me, the cold tendrils of the thing still wrapping around my limbs, tightening their grip with every passing second. There was no ground beneath me, no air to breathe, just an overwhelming sense of being consumed by something far greater than I could comprehend. I was being dragged downward into the very heart of the town, as though the earth itself had opened up to claim me. The hum was deafening now, a constant, vibrating presence that reverberated through my bones, through my soul. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body felt heavy, like it was made of lead. The thing was everywhere, its tendrils stretching out from every corner, wrapping around me, pulling me closer to something I couldn't see but could feel, an ancient, all-consuming force. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The tendrils released me, and I collapsed to the ground. I gasped for air, my chest heaving as though I'd been underwater for far too long. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the world. The hum had vanished, leaving only a suffocating silence in its wake. The town, the park, the fountain, all of it had disappeared. I was no longer in the place I'd known. The surroundings were alien, a strange void of endless blackness, devoid of any light. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins as I struggled to rise to my feet. Is this it? I thought, my mind racing. Had I been pulled into another realm? Was this the end? But then the faintest light began to flicker in the distance. A pale, ethereal glow that slowly brightened as I stumbled toward it, my feet barely touching the ground. The light grew stronger as I approached, and with it came the unmistakable sound of the town's hum, though it was softer now, distant. My heart skipped a beat. Was I back? And then, as I stepped through the veil of light, I found myself standing in the center of the same town I had tried to leave so many times. The streets, the houses, the park with the fountain, it was all exactly the same. Nothing had changed, except for one thing. There were no people. Not a single soul stirred. The houses stood silent, their windows dark. The streets were empty, the air still. I could feel the weight of the absence pressing against me, suffocating in its silence. The town, though physically unchanged, was different now. It was dead, as though the very life had been drained from it, leaving only an eerie shell behind. And in the distance, the fountain still standing seemed almost alive in its stillness, its waters black as night. I walked through the empty streets, my footsteps echoing in the dead quiet, a stark contrast to the pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming or if I had somehow crossed into a place beyond this world. Every building, every corner of the town felt wrong, like it had been carved from some dark version of reality. The air was thick, stifling, as if the very oxygen had been altered, twisted into something unnatural. I tried to call out, but no sound came. My voice, if I could even call it that, was lost in the void. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. As I reached the fountain, I stopped. There it was again, the hum, so faint I could barely hear it. But it was there, a constant, vibrating presence that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. It was impossible to ignore. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the fountain, unsure of what to do next. The events that had led me here, the things I had seen, the horrors I had experienced, they seemed so far away now, as though they belonged to another life, another world. Yet, I knew they were real. I knew the thing in the fountain, the shadowy mass that had come alive, had been real. And I knew that whatever had happened to me, whatever force had pulled me into this strange version of the town, was still out there, somewhere, waiting. The question lingered in my mind, unanswered, as I stood there in the dead silence of the empty town. Was I free? I turned, making my way down the empty streets again, but something stopped me. A sudden, sharp pain shot through my chest, like a needle being driven deep into my heart. I gasped, clutching my chest, but the pain only grew stronger, suffocating me. And then, through the haze of agony, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the street, just outside the reach of the light. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, but as it stepped closer, I could see the shape of a person, tall, shadowy, their face obscured. I wanted to scream, to run, but the pain was unbearable, paralyzing. My legs wouldn't move, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure as it slowly approached, its presence growing stronger with each step. And then it spoke. "It's not over." The voice was a soft whisper, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My vision blurred as the pain intensified, and I stumbled backward, barely able to breathe. I was trapped, caught between the darkness of the town and the suffocating force of whatever this was. My body was numb, my thoughts unraveling as the figure reached out a hand toward me. I tried to scream again, but nothing came. The darkness closed in, the hum of the town growing louder, vibrating through my skull. And then, just like that, I woke up. I gasped for air, my body covered in sweat, my heart racing. I was lying in my bed back in the real world, I thought. The sun was rising outside the window, casting a soft glow over the room. But even as I sat up, shaking, I knew something was wrong. Something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still connected to that town, still tethered to it in some way. It haunted me, clung to me, like a ghost I couldn't escape. Was I still trapped in that place? Was I still part of it? Had I really left, or was I simply caught in some endless loop, unable to break free? I couldn't say. The answers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the town, its hum, its shadows, its presence was now a part of me, and it would never let go. I spent days after that waking up in a cold sweat, the terror of the town still clinging to me, even in the waking world. The feeling of its darkness, the hum that never quite left my mind, it was as if I had never truly left that place. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still following me, lingering in the shadows of my life. It was impossible to shake the vision of the town, its empty streets, the fountain with its dark water. The quiet had settled into my life, but it was the kind of quiet that feels oppressive. I thought about the figure, the one who whispered, "It's not over." It nodded me, even now. Had it been a warning? A threat? Or just a simple statement of fact? What if the town never truly left me? What if it was just waiting, biding its time for me to come back? I tried to go back to normal life, tried to pretend nothing had happened. I went to work, I talked to my friends, I did everything that I had done before. But the weight of it all never lifted. I saw the shadows in the corner of my vision, always watching, always just out of reach. And at night, when I closed my eyes, I could hear the hum soft at first, barely noticeable, but it was there, like a memory that wouldn't fade. There were moments when I thought I saw something familiar, someone from the town, or at least someone who looked like them, standing across the street or staring from a distance. Every time, I'd blink and they'd be gone. But the feeling remained, as strong and as clear as it had been the moment I left that place. It was as if I was always being watched, always being pulled back to where it all began. I tried to convince myself that I had dreamed it all, that the town had been nothing more than a strange figment of my imagination, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion or stress. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The world I'd been in was real. The dark force that had taken over the town, the eerie silence of the streets, the presence of the thing in the fountain, none of it had been a dream. The longer I lived with it, the more I began to understand. The town hadn't let go of me. It had become a part of me, woven into the fabric of my existence. I thought I could escape, but in the end, I couldn't. It had been waiting for me all along, watching, lurking just out of sight. I started to wonder if anyone else had experienced it, if anyone else had come across the town, just as I had. Had they been caught in its grip, just like me? Or was I the only one? I wanted to ask, to find out, but I feared that doing so would only drag me deeper into the nightmare. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince myself it was over. I stopped pretending that everything was fine. There was a strange comfort in accepting the reality of it all. I realized that there was no escape, that the town and its horrors had already found their way into my soul. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, I would always carry it with me. It's funny, isn't it? How we spend our lives trying to escape the things that haunt us. We think we can outrun them, hide from them, forget them. But sometimes the things that haunt us don't fade. They don't disappear with time. They become part of who we are, stitched into our past and our futures. You can try to outrun them, but in the end, they'll always find you. And sometimes you don't need to run. Sometimes the best you can do is accept that you're already where you need to be, no matter how terrifying it is. I know now that the town is still out there. I know it waits for me, just beyond the edge of this world, just beyond my reach. But I've come to accept it. I don't know if it will ever let me go, but I've learned to live with it. Maybe that's the only choice I have, the only choice any of us have. So, the next time you're driving down a lonely road and you find yourself lost, don't be surprised if you stumble upon a town that doesn't show up on any map. Don't be surprised if the streets are empty, if the air feels thick, if you hear that faint hum in the distance. And don't be surprised if you feel a presence watching you, waiting for you. Because it's out there. And once you're there, it might just be too late to turn back.